Thank you. Is that, oh, perfect. Okay, and I know the text is very small on this, so I will be taking you through it. The presentation itself is in a PDF format as well. And so if you email me, or maybe Pastor Don, I'll make sure he has a copy. We can provide it to you, because there's references for everything I say. I'm a scientist. I'm sorry if I'm going to go into a little bit of technical detail, but I'll try to keep it relevant to the presentation. Just my background is I have been a professor at the University of British Columbia for almost 35 years. I'm a biochemist by training. I'm also the founder and chief scientific officer of Connexus, so I'll be talking a little bit about that. Founded it with my wife, Catherine Sutter, who's with me. And I'm also the vice president of the Canadian COVID Care Alliance and co-chair of the Scientific and Medical Advisory Committee. Now, as a UBC professor, I'm obligated to let you know conflicts of interest I have. And so the main conflict of interest here is that I'm actually, with Catherine, the major owners of Connexus. So that also, the views that are being expressed here are my views. But as you'll see, they actually reflect the views of many of the people on the Scientific and Medical Advisory Committee of the Canadian COVID Care Alliance, although it doesn't necessarily has been endorsed by the organization as a whole. And it's definitely not what many of my colleagues at UBC want me to talk about, so it doesn't reflect necessarily their views. So everything I'm going to tell you is really not just me saying it, it's actually backed up by a large group of scientists, medical doctors, professors from across Canada. We have 36 members that are in the Canadian COVID Care Alliance on the Scientific and Medical Advisory Committee. We have about 600 plus members that are actually health professionals. And we have about 16 committees, and I co-chair with Dr. Chris Shaw, actually the Scientific and Medical Advisory Committee. We call it SMAC for short. And so Dr. Christopher Shaw, he's also at the University of British Columbia, as is a couple of our other members. But we represent really trained immunologists, virologists, people with experience in microbiology and infectious diseases, pharmacology, biochemistry, in reviewing the scientific literature. We've been meeting for about 2 years, every week, by Zoom. We produced a number of videos and documents. Some of you may have seen those. They're available at the Canadian COVID Care Alliance website, .org. And we've also have email correspondences daily. So we're really up to what's ever coming out. So we have a lot of eyes and ears that are out combing the scientific literature. Now, to come to the pandemic with COVID-19 itself, this profile here is at the beginning of the pandemic officially in mid-March of 2020 to actually just a week ago. And this is, the top here is showing you the incidence of COVID cases as reported, usually verified by PCR tests. And the bottom is the death counts. And as you can see with each of these waves, one of the largest peaks of deaths occurred early in the pandemic when apparently we didn't have that many cases. Now, of course, that was a reflection of the testing and the availability of the PCR test at the time. The genome of the virus that causes COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, was actually, the sequence of the genome came out in mid-January from the Chinese government. And that allowed us to develop very specific tests for this virus. Now, as you can see, what's intriguing is that the vaccines started really in mid-December of 2020. It was available to those that were at high risk, the elderly and those with multiple comorbidities. But after that period, the vaccines became available. But nonetheless, you can see that we still had a very high incidence. However, when you calculate the number of people who had it versus the number of people that have died with it, and I emphasize with it, that's actually about 4 to 5-fold less per capita than earlier on. So the virus had been mutating to forms which are actually more benign. They're more infectious, but they're less likely to actually cause disease. Now I want to point out here, in the statistics, we've had about 50,500 people who have died with COVID. We think that about half of those are not from COVID, that they had comorbidities, they were in the hospitals for different reasons, but when they were tested, using a PCR test, that at the cycle threshold number that they use, over 35 cycles, is 90% inaccurate for giving false positives. Okay, so that's important to understand. But with the data that's official from Health Canada, basically we had about 14,642 deaths in 2020. And despite the availability of these vaccines, which we'll talk about, it didn't go down. And in fact, as more people became vaccinated, it actually went up the number of deaths with COVID by 39%. Okay? So that's not the way that vaccines are supposed to work. Now the virus itself is very small. It's about 0.15 microns. A micron is a millionth of a meter. And the influenza virus is actually about the same size, 0.1 microns. So what we've learned from pandemics in the past with influenza applies to the SARS-CoV-2 virus as well, because it's also a respiratory virus. And I like to point out that the masks that people have been wearing, even if you use the N95, which is considered the best mask, the pore size, the median pore size, which means that half of the pores are going to be actually around 35 microns in size. So that's, if your virus is on little aerosol droplets, the largest droplet that doesn't fall right to the ground is about 60 microns. And if any of you have actually tried to weigh a teardrop, which is about 50 microns, you'll notice that it actually steadily evaporates on a balance. So even if you have a mask that traps these aerosols, they will evaporate to smaller and smaller until you do breathe them in. And so it's not surprising that a study that just got published last week, and this is the Cochrane report. Cochrane is a medical organization that does very detailed statistical analyses of the scientific literature, and they concluded in their study that for a pandemic with influenza and a pandemic now with data from COVID-19, that these masks are ineffective at preventing the transmission and receipt of the SARS-CoV-2 virus or the influenza virus in an aerosol. There's really, we knew this from the start because even Health Canada had published reports, even 20 years ago, that masks were ineffective against influenza in a pandemic. This is the reason why Bonnie Henry didn't support the wearing of masks early in the pandemic, and neither did Anthony Fauci. And then they reversed their decision, and then it was imposed. But to date, from the data that's available, the masks are ineffective in the pandemic of influenza or COVID-19. Next slide. Oh, I'll do that, sorry. Okay, so the virus itself is, like I say, pretty small. It has a single genome. It's RNA. This genetic material allows the encoding of 28 genes, roughly, that encode separate proteins. They're like the little molecular robots that work inside the virus to make it work, to allow it to attach to a cell, and then once it gets in, to duplicate itself and go through this cycle as it infects the rest of the cells in the body. Now, this virus, this RNA that's inside the virus, that's coated with proteins like the nucleocapsid protein, it undergoes constant mutation. Every time it divides, there's mistakes that are introduced into the structure of that genome. And so there's tens of thousands of different mutant forms of SARS-CoV-2 out there. But the ones that we're most interested in are what we call the variants of concern. The mutations that they have confer extra properties so that they're more infectious and they're more benign. They actually mutate to become less likely to cause severe disease. And you may wonder, well, why would that be? And the reason is that the viruses that are most likely to be transmissible, of course, if they're more infectious, that will happen, but also the host, if they're not as sick, they're not aware that they've been infected, and so it's easier for the virus to spread to another person. If it's very deadly, like Ebola, this does not spread very easily because we can see the person's very sick and they die quite quickly in many cases. So this is the natural course of viruses. We've had at least 4 different coronaviruses that are already endemic in the environment that probably started off like SARS-CoV-2 that caused the common cold. And SARS-CoV-1, 20 years ago, where it was a pandemic, there was a few hundred people that died from it, not the numbers that we're seeing now. It's actually more deadly than SARS-CoV-2. But after a year, it was essentially gone. People weren't going to the hospital. They weren't dying. There was no vaccines. There was no drugs to treat that specifically. And so basically what happened was the virus mutated and got replaced by variants which are actually much more benign. I'm pretty sure that's what's happened. And it explains some of the data that I'll show you later. So, as I was mentioning, we have these different colors correspond to the different variants of concern that have dominated. And one of the key things that I want to point out here is that when we start dealing with this pink area here, this is Delta, and this is Omicron variants, which have continued to evolve. And actually, we have a whole bunch of Omicron variants now in the BXX and others that are in this area. But you can go from one variant, the Delta variant, being dominant in BC in November of 2021, to a month later having the Omicron variant being the dominant variant in BC. So you can have these variants displace each other in as little as a month. Okay, and this is more recent data. Again, this is from the BC Centre for Disease Control here. And all you need to see is the other, with the most recent data, these are all the other variants that have been now described. So we're actually having a very interesting situation. Early on, we had a variety of different variants that would predominate, and now we're at a stage where we're actually getting all these different variants at about the same time. So basically what's happening is with these variants, they all have very similar properties. So there is no one variant that's that much better than the other variant for infecting people. And that's where we're at now, a lot of different variants. Now, not to get too upset about that, because those variants are very, very similar to each other. And so if you have antibodies against one of those variants, then those antibodies probably work very well against the other variants too. So we develop natural immunity when we're exposed to this virus, And when we recover, it is because our immune system has in fact taken it out. It's learned to recognize the virus and develop that capacity. So everybody is a survivor of COVID. Now, in the room, about half of you stood up as having COVID, but in fact, I'm pretty confident all of you have had COVID. Well, not COVID, but all of you have been infected. COVID's the disease. SARS-CoV-2 is the virus that causes it. All of you have been infected with SARS-CoV-2 and you've made antibodies against it and you have immunity to a certain extent. Immunity doesn't necessarily mean that you won't get infected and maybe even get sick again, but you should not get as sick and you should be able to recover. So when you have natural immunity, again, this is an aerosol-borne virus. It comes in through your mouth and nasal passages and starts working in the upper lungs. In those zones, you actually have a type of antibodies. We call them IgA and IgM antibodies. These are secreted into those spaces. They're evolved to take on an infectious disease that's airborne, or also that might get into your intestinal system. There, again, these types of antibodies work very effectively. And the virus itself can only cause an infection because it's able to recognize protein, in particular the ACE2 protein, angiotensin converting enzyme 2, that's on the surface of certain cells. When you're a young child, the levels of this ACE2 protein is actually very low. So it's actually harder for the virus to replicate in children. And they have a very powerful innate immune system. And that gives them extra protection as well. So this is the reason why almost all children in BC have been infected already with SARS-CoV-2, I should say, and they have antibodies against it, but most of the children that were infected had no symptoms at all. And they acquired that, by the way, not from each other, but from other people in the home, usually the adults. It's not the children infecting and passing it on to grandma or grandpa. Okay, so in our lab, we were very interested at Connexus to determine, well, we had this capacity in our company to actually take, knowing the structure of the genome for the virus, to predict the structures of all the proteins encoded by that genetic information, and we could actually make all of those proteins artificially in our lab in little pieces. So we actually made it in about over 6,000 pieces, and then we took blood from people who got antibodies because they recovered from SARS-CoV-2 infection. They had COVID-19, they were sick and recovered, so they had antibodies, and we want to know where was it, which parts of these proteins was it that these antibodies were against. This kind of information could be very useful because you can actually take those pieces and inject them into a person, and they would make antibodies against those pieces, and then those pieces, those antibodies in turn could then recognize the actual virus if you got infected. So this is the basis of a vaccine. In our company, we've made over 1,600 antibodies for research purposes in rabbits against cancer proteins. So this is a very straightforward technology. So we have to date about 4,000 people that have participated in our study that we've measured their antibody levels. Half of them are female and the other half obviously male. And about a third of them, or a little more than a third, actually had COVID-19. They're PCR positive tested or rapid antigen tested. And so we could then compare what their antibody levels were like to a person that theoretically should never have actually been exposed to the virus yet and shouldn't have antibodies. The problem is that when we started our study early in March, and we tested people around this time in the spring of 2020, we found that 90% of the people we tested already had antibodies against the virus. And we worked with the BC Women's and Children's Hospital with Dr. Pascal Lavoie's group, and they had a different test for the virus that was an antibody-based test, and they had 276 healthy workers, of which half of them were healthcare workers, these adults, and 90% of them had antibodies against the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And when we look at our entire study, up to when we looked at this last in November, and we have more data, but I'm just showing the data here from the earlier 2 years, 3/4 of the people that we've tested in total in our study had antibodies that reported being sick with COVID-19-like symptoms in December of 2019, January, February, and March of 2020. 3/4 of all the people we've tested to date. That's the first time. And the fact that they had those symptoms and that we can measure antibodies against the SARS-CoV-2 virus proteins means that they did have COVID-19. They were infected. So the biggest wave of infection happened before we did anything in our community to even recognize that the virus started. The first wave was not starting in mid-March. It started probably in early December, maybe even late November, because we have positives in November, okay? So that's the reason why it's so common in our community. Okay, and of those people, I would say about 1/4 of them got COVID again about 2 years later when the Omicron wave hit. But when we have been tracking the symptoms, they've been much more mild with the second infection. Well, with our test, the key point that I really want to make here is that natural immunity is actually quite long-lasting. It's not, I wish Bonnie Henry could take a look at the data. The data tells her that, yes, antibodies from infection last more than 3 months. They last for years. We knew this for SARS-CoV-1 when we had studies that go back. In fact, in our own lab, we've been testing people to see if they have antibodies against SARS-CoV-1. And we can detect it 20 years later in these people. But what's interesting is each spot here on this person is if you have a dark spot, it means that they have antibodies against that part of the virus. And these are the same test applied, in this case, to 9 different people. And what we see is that the patterns, this is our control spot here, to make sure the test is working. All the rest are unique to SARS-CoV-2 proteins. The pattern is different in every person. So when you're infected, the antibodies that you make are unique. They reflect the genomics and your past history of what you've been exposed to before in terms of what your antibody response is. But the key point is you don't just make one antibody against the virus or one of its proteins. You're making hundreds of antibodies against different parts of the different proteins. So you get a very broad protection. And this is very different, for example, with the vaccine. You're only getting one of those 28 proteins, the spike protein. It's a very big protein, but your antibody response is more directed. And even those are going to be very different from person to person with the vaccine. But that pattern, this is the same people here, so this person is that same person, this is the same as that person. What we see is that the pattern stays the same, even almost a year later. This is 10 months later here. So normally, when you've been infected, you will produce an antibody response, and those antibodies will actually remain high until such a time as the pathogen disappears, your body is taking care of it, taking it out, and the B cells, these immune cells that produce the antibodies, they hibernate. They actually go quiescent, they go to sleep. They don't die, they're still there. But the antibody levels will decline. The IgA and the IgM antibodies last about 5-6 days, and they have to be constantly replaced. The IgG antibodies that you would produce in your blood they're about 21 days, but they will be replaced. So if you don't have the pathogen, you don't produce any more anyway, so your antibody levels decline. But you can see here, because we're in a pandemic that's been ongoing, you're constantly being reboosted naturally from the environment. You don't need to get a booster shot. Just living your life normally and being exposed to the virus in the environment keeps your immune system tuned up. And we took that larger test, we narrowed it down to a simpler test, which is what we do at Connexus now for the last year and a half. And just to give you an idea of a control spot, here's a person who did not have COVID. The blots are that clean, right? These are all people who've had COVID. The patterns are different, but they're very clearly have been infected and we can see it. Interestingly, this is covering 10 different proteins. The D1, 2, 3, and 4 spots here you can see here, and here's another case. Here's a person who's got very strong D1, 2, 3, or 4 spots. That's the nucleocapsid protein antibodies. So all the serological tests that are being done to determine whether or not you've been previously infected, they're based on looking at the nucleocapsid protein of the virus. Whereas the spike protein antibodies could become from either a natural infection or the vaccine. But in our studies, half the people who've been infected don't make antibodies against the nucleocapsid protein in our study. So all the official government estimates and all the studies that have been done in clinical studies to determine whether or not that person has previously been infected is using a marker that in half the people that have actually been infected does not show up in the test. Because we cover 10 proteins, we know that that person in fact has been infected. I know a personal case of one individual who had COVID. It was so bad, they went to the hospital. It was an elderly gentleman, and he basically recovered. He went to Life Labs, had the test done about 2 months later, completely negative. Then we tested him 4 months after that, and he was loaded with antibodies, but no nucleocapsid protein antibodies. Okay, so this natural immunity, really, even though these tests with the nucleocapsid directed antibodies tests, they still show in children, for example, in the United States, this was actually over a year ago, they had already had 75% of the children tested already had antibodies that were against, in their cases, the nucleocapsid protein. And in the United Kingdom, in England, basically school pupils, again, a year ago, basically 97% of the high school students and 62% of the elementary school students all had already been infected. And the vast majority of these were completely asymptomatic. They didn't even know that they were infected. And recently, the BC Centre for Disease Control did an analysis, again, using the nucleocapsid protein as a marker. And what they found was that for children under 19 years of age, 70 to 80% of them had already been infected with the virus. And they claim that for adults under 60, as much as 70% actually were already infected with the virus, naturally. And bearing in mind that during this period of time, we have about 87% of the population is at least double vaccinated. Okay. And for the elderly, they're getting a lower number, but again, I think this is because the sensitivity of the test doesn't show that many of those elderly people already have been infected and have antibodies. Now, this is a busy slide, but what I want to try to impress upon you is that each of these columns is a different variant of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Starting with the Wuhan strain, the variation, if it's different, it shows up with color. And these are the Omicron, early Omicron variants, BA.1, .1.1, .2, and you can see there's a lot more changes here with these variants than we see with the Alpha, Delta, Epsilon, Gamma variants. But even with the mutations that occur in the spike protein here of the Omicron variants, they're 97.3% identical in structure to the original Wuhan strain. So when you're making antibodies against all these different parts of, for example, the spike protein, you would only get a reduction in your antibody levels that would recognize the latest strain by 3%. So your immune protection is largely intact. Some of these mutations occur in what we call the receptor binding domain, but you can have effective killing of these virus particles with antibodies sticking to them for your immune system to see it and pull it out. So this is good news. This is the very reason why they still give you the spike protein that's from the original Wuhan strain until recently. They've now these bivalent vaccines. But the bivalent vaccines don't work any better than the original vaccine. But you still get some protection for a limited period of time. So I'll explain that momentarily a bit more, though. It's not as kind of protection you might expect. So when we originally tried to identify the different parts of the virus that people made antibodies against, these are all different parts of the spike protein, the nucleocapsid protein, and the membrane protein, which is also present on the surface of cells. So if you had antibodies against the membrane protein, those are also protective against the virus.
Peter's going to die.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you. Oh, yes. The key point of showing this slide is I've highlighted in yellow all the regions where the mutations would occur in the protein. And what we see is that most of the mutations are in the parts of the spike protein that people don't really make antibodies against. So it means that your antibody response is even better than 97% intact against the Omicron variants. So what we've seen and is acknowledged now, which for some strange reason, the public health authorities really push this narrative. It's widely accepted that COVID-19 vaccines do not prevent infection with SARS-CoV-2. Because most of the people that are infected, that are in hospital, have been vaccinated. So clearly, it doesn't. So then the idea was, well, does it prevent transmission? No, it doesn't. It turns out that people that have been vaccinated have COVID-19, compared to people who are unvaccinated with COVID-19, have equal viral loads. They're just as infectious as each other. So you're not preventing infection, and you're not preventing transmission. Moreover, they say, well, yeah, but, the severity of the COVID, people get COVID and they say, well, thank God I was vaccinated, at least I could have died. Well, no. How do you, there's no measures of this, okay? The original 6-month Pfizer clinical trial showed that more people that were in the vaccinated group died than in the unvaccinated group. It was a really small number, but it was more severe effects in the vaccinated group. About 5% of them had severe injury from the vaccine, compared to 0 in the unvaccinated group. And there was more deaths during that 6-month period in the vaccinated group. There's absolutely no evidence to support that statement. Okay, and it's really hard to tell now, because if you've got a virus that's mutating to a form which is more benign, and the population is developing natural immunity, how can you possibly tell that the vaccine is actually reducing the severity of COVID-19? Okay. So even now, when you look at hospital data, early on, there was all kinds of funny things that were being done. They would say, oh, if you look at all the people that are in hospital, they're all unvaccinated. But what they do is they take the data from mid-December of 2020, when for at least 6 months, more than half the population isn't vaccinated, which is when the major peaks of the SARS-CoV-2 waves occurred. And they take all that data and they just lump it all together, and they say this. When you look at recent data, what we're seeing is that there's no difference now between people that are actually vaccinated or unvaccinated for hospitalizations and deaths. In fact, it's starting to go the other way. That is, you're more likely to be hospitalized if you are vaccinated. You're more likely to die if you're vaccinated. So even early on, we recognized that in the clinical studies that were done, when they talked about that 95% efficacy of the vaccines, well, that was relative risk reduction. Only about 1% of the people in the entire clinical study actually got COVID. And again, it's using the PCR test at 35 cycles, which is 90% inaccurate. So what we see is that you have to calculate what we call absolute risk reduction. And so what that means is that if you, in a 6-month period, vaccinated everybody, that vaccination would reduce the occurrence of COVID in the population by less than 1%. Absolute risk reduction. We tried at the Canadian COVID Care Alliance to put a press release out to explain the difference between absolute risk reduction and relative risk reduction. The FDA says that we should never use relative risk reduction to describe the efficacy of a product, like a vaccine. So we went to Canadian Newswire Services. They would not run this press release because it would discourage vaccination. This is the kind of censorship that's at play, which is why you hardly see any of this kind of material in any kind of mainstream newspaper or TV or radio. Okay. Now, the other thing, too, is that as time has gone on, with the first shot and second shot combo, there was about 6 months that you'd have the relative risk reduction reduced by about 50%. After that, the vaccine is more likely not to protect you. And then with the repeated shots, the boosters, we're now seeing that in the adult population, the relative risk reduction dropping less than 50% is now barely 4 months. And it seems that with the more recent booster shots, up to 5, it's now being even barely 2 months. Okay, so the body with repeated booster shots is beginning to think that this is natural, it's in the environment, and that it should ignore it. And this is why people that are heavily vaccinated have negative efficacy after a short protection window. But that protection window isn't right from the start of your vaccination. You're actually more likely to get infected when you first get vaccinated, okay? Okay. So why do I say that? Well, in the data from Alberta Health, for about 6 months, they actually tracked to see if you were vaccinated and you got COVID, when did you most likely get it? And you were most likely to get it 7 days to 9 days after you've been vaccinated. So here you can see the risk. This is different age groups. This is 12-year-olds, and 75-year-olds are in the blue. And when they looked at total cases, the first day, the risk is very low, and it rises on the next day, and rises and rises and rises till day 7, stays high, and then comes down as a person's immune system kicks in to produce antibodies. So you're more likely to get infected right when you're vaccinated, especially when you're in a wave of the pandemic and the virus is in the environment. Now the question is, well, why would that happen? Why would you be more likely to get COVID right after you're vaccinated? And the reason is actually quite simple. When you're vaccinated, you are being vaccinated in your arm with tens of trillions of lipid nanoparticles. Each lipid nanoparticle, size of a virus, contains 5 to 10 copies of the spike gene. From each of these RNA molecules, you can generate hundreds of copies of the spike protein. It's just basically providing the information to your own body cells to manufacture that protein in massive doses, which gets expressed then on the surface of your body cells. So in order to elicit an immune reaction, it means that your own immune system has to attack and destroy those cells. It generates what we call exosomes, tiny little fragments from those cells that now other immune cells, macrophages, neutrophils, other antigen-presenting cells, they gobble up those little pieces that contain the spike protein on them, and then within those cells, it's dissected into pieces and then presented with other proteins on those immune cells so that those cells, when they go to the lymph nodes of your body, where the T cells and the B cells are located, and if any of those T cells or B cells recognize that little fragment, then that cell is stimulated to grow and divide and create a whole clonal army of cells that recognize that little fragment of the virus. And so, when the virus comes in again, now you've got antibodies from the B cells, and you've also got T cells that will recognize cells that are infected with that virus, and it'll attack those cells so that it stops the virus replication. So in order to get an immune response with the vaccine, you have to destroy and attack your own cells. If you have natural infection, those immune cells attack the virus directly in your airway spaces or in your blood. They do not attack your own cells. It's a totally different mechanism. And presently, there's over 200 different vaccines now being developed for other viruses that use the same RNA technology. And this is something to be very worried about. And so I was mentioning, I can show you lots of data, but just to point out that here we can look at recent data of in March and May, this is Quebec data, and they looked at hospitalizations, and we have people who are unvaccinated down here in the yellow. In the first peak we were seeing earlier on slightly more people that were unvaccinated that were showing up in the hospital, but as 2022 came along, if you're going to be hospitalized, the people that are double or triple vaccinated now account for the vast majority. And this is adjusted per capita. So we take into account the fact that we have less people that are vaccinated. So per capita. So you're more likely to actually be hospitalized. Now, if we look at the overall risks for people for getting sick, being hospitalized, ICU admissions, or deaths, if you're under age 19, your chances of dying from COVID-19 is about, it's in the order of like maybe 3 in a million. Your risk is extremely low. If you take everybody in the population now, those that are elderly and with comorbidities, in this room, nobody statistically should have actually gotten COVID and died. It's about 1 in 1,000. And in fact, for people under 60, it's 0.036. So you're looking somewhere, certainly you're getting into maybe 3, 4 out of 100,000 people if you're under 60. So the risks are extremely low. So when we have children that have such low risks, the question is, well, why are we vaccinating them? If they've already have natural immunity, why would you want to vaccinate children that are at such low risk in the first place? Knowing that it doesn't prevent transmission, so they're not even really a vector for spreading the disease. If you're elderly, the risks are very high. The average age of someone who dies of COVID-19 in BC is about 84 years of age. The average age of someone dying in BC is 81 years of age. Okay. So really this efficacy with children, what we're finding is that even if you vaccinate them, it's not very effective. And the reason why we do it is just not justified by the results of the clinical studies. So this is the Pfizer vaccine. And basically, in one study in the US, they looked at about 6,897 sites, and they looked at children 5 to 11 years old. They tested about 74,000 children, and from that, they found that the effectiveness after the 2 doses, basically after 4.5 months, was negative efficacy. They actually were more likely to get infected if they were vaccinated after that period of time. The efficacy was 60%, so that borderline 50%, but after 2 months it was down to almost 29%. Now, just to put that in perspective, the influenza virus that we're coming out of that flu season that has put so many children into the hospital, the vaccine that they give you for the variant that is there has about a 29% efficacy. So, and for RSV, there is no vaccine. And studies in the United States have shown that 97% of children have RSV before they're actually 2 years old. So what we've done with all these measures, more by isolating kids so they are not getting exposed to these viruses, is that we've taken 3 seasons of flu and we've condensed it into 1 season. So that's why our hospitals for pediatrics has been overwhelmed. It's catch-up time. It's the exact opposite of what Bonnie Henry described for flattening the curve for COVID-19. What we've done is we've concentrated the curve for actually RSV. Okay. So these studies that have been done with 5 to 11-year-olds, here's another one in New York State. 365,000 students, 5 to 11 years old. At the peak of the Omicron wave, the efficacy of these vaccines was 12%. I don't even think that's even statistically significant. So, well, how did they approve these vaccines based on this data? And this now takes us down rather an ominous, because of the implications of how effective our regulatory agencies are in protecting the population. So these children, when they did their original study here, they had about 1,673 students, children aged, in this case, 2 to 5-year-olds, and they had placebos. It was a smaller group, about half the size, so bear that in mind. But the bottom line here, after dose 3, because the study was designed for 2 doses, and it turned out that after 2 doses it had negative efficacy. You're more likely to get COVID if you were in the vaccinated group than the unvaccinated group. And remember I told you how that first 2 weeks you're more likely to get COVID if you've been vaccinated. Well, bear in mind that in all the statistics that have been given to you by BC Center for Disease Control and others, is that if you get COVID in the first 3 weeks, with your first shot, you were considered unvaccinated. And that data was plunked in with the unvaccinated group. Okay, so this is what's happening here. They're getting negative efficacy, but at the end of the day, out of the 1,673 that got through to the end of the trial, many of the children didn't complete the whole trial, for reasons that are not explained, probably because they had vaccine injury and didn't want to get shot again. 2 of these in the vaccinated group actually got COVID. 5 in the unvaccinated group. Now when you calculate that, because this group is about half the size, or 40% of the size of this group, that's an efficacy of 75%. But the reality is, the difference between the 2 groups is only 3 kids. Now, you think that's bad. You look at the data that was done on the 6-month to the 23-month-old children. And the difference between those 2 groups was actually 1 child. Would you ever approve a drug to treat somebody, or a vaccine that's protecting, on the basis of a single child? And that's what they did. Now, to put this in perspective, my colleagues aren't idiots. And in fact, there are panels of scientists that come together to make decisions to inform agencies like the FDA. So when we had the booster shot proposed in the United States, they had a panel of experts, 18 of them, that looked to see, should we have a 3rd shot for adults with the COVID-19 vaccines? 16 out of the 18 members on that panel voted against a 3rd shot for adults. Only 2 for it. A week later, the FDA approved it. Okay. Okay, so, well, now we're hearing about, this hybrid immunity, that, well, it's great that you've been infected, and if you can combine that with a booster shot, you're going to be even better protected. But is that what the data shows us? Well, what we do see here from studies where this has been examined, using the nucleocapsid protein as a measure of whether someone has been infected before, and again, it's not always showing everyone who's been infected. What they found is that people who had natural immunity, that 93% of them had an antibody response against the spike, against the nucleocapsid protein, indicating that they had, sorry, I get this backwards. The 40% here were protected. They were not producing the protection in the 40% here if they were previously vaccinated, whereas they had 93% of those that had natural immunity had antibodies in that study against the nucleocapsid protein. So simply by being vaccinated and then getting infected, you actually had a lower antibody response, a natural immune response, if you've been previously vaccinated, by at least more than half a reduction. And here, even a non-vaccinated person with a mild case of COVID-19 had a 71% chance of having antibodies against the nucleocapsid proteins, compared to a 15% chance if they had been previously vaccinated in that other study. So you actually are reducing your natural immunity if you get vaccinated. Okay, so again, believe it or not, these vaccines are still in phase 3 clinical studies, not to be concluded till the summer. When they did the original Pfizer study, 2 months after the 6-month study commenced, they unblinded the study. 89% of the people in the unvaccinated group decided to get vaccinated because it was so wonderful. So we actually have very few people who are actually unvaccinated to tell us really the difference between the long-term health implications of these vaccines. But, as you might expect, if you're having repeated inflammatory attacks against your own tissues, this is a recipe for autoimmune diseases. So my personal concern, being involved in neurology, is diseases like Alzheimer's and multiple sclerosis. But type 1 diabetes, there's been, for example, a report in the original clinical study from Moderna, one of the children actually developed type 1 diabetes. Probably because the vaccine was taken up by their pancreatic beta islet cells, and their immune system now attacked and destroyed those beta islet cells, so the child can't produce insulin anymore. They're type 1 diabetic. And that was in the original clinical study. Okay. So, vaccines are safe and effective. I think I've already talked about the effective part. Are they truly safe? Well, the VAERS system in the United States here, this is the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. It's been in business for over 31 years. It was set up by the FDA as a means to indicate if there was any dangers with products that were already on the market. They have these for vaccines, and they also have them for drugs. But this is for the vaccines. And this is the total number of reports of death, really, since 1980 here, or 1990, I should say. And you can see it's pretty low, and then all of a sudden, you get these peaks. There are more reports of injury, more hospitalizations, more deaths with the 3 COVID-19 vaccines approved in the United States in the last 2 years than all of the other vaccines put together for the last 30 years. This is what we call a warning signal. And the FDA is certainly well aware of it. Now, the argument is, this is correlative, but it doesn't mean it's causal. But the sooner the event occurs to the time of the actual injection, this is day 0, day 1, day 2, day 3, the more likely it's actually been caused by the vaccine. Okay, so in total in the US, we have about 32,000 deaths that from the US alone that have been linked with the vaccine. Now, the problem is the VAERS system is thought to underreport the number of actual injuries by as much as they think only 1.5% to 2% are actually reported. So we take the numbers in VAERS and we multiply them by typically 40. Okay, now think about that. If you're getting 32,000 deaths and you multiply that by 40, we're getting to the numbers of deaths from the vaccine, potentially, to the actual number of people who've died of COVID-19 in the US. Bearing in mind that in the US, most of those COVID-19 cases were actually not death from COVID-19. In fact, in the United States, if you were hospitalized and the costs are going to be borne by the government, you would get twice as much money if it was a COVID-19 case than if it was actually a non-COVID-19 case. So there is a high financial incentive to declare these cases. So, I don't think we're that much different from the Americans when it comes down to it in our physiology. But per capita, you were 7 times more likely to die of COVID if you were an American than if you were a Canadian. Okay. So what I've been saying here about the VAERS system, this is also true in the United Kingdom's yellow card system, in the European Medicine Agency's adverse reporting system, and the World Health Organization VIGI access system, which goes back 30 years as well. So this is not unique to the United States. This is actually a phenomenon that's well known. If we look at vaccine safety issues in the World Health Organization's VIGI access system, we can look at the rates in total of reported injuries. This is like 4 million by 2021. But the rate here basically, compared to diphtheria vaccines, is about 78,489 times more, taking into account just for the last year. This is for the 1 year comparison, like the same time period. Okay, you're compared to an influenza vaccine, you're about 148 times more likely to have an adverse reaction with a COVID vaccine than the influenza vaccine. And I told you, you're being injected with tens of trillions of lipid nanoparticles that spread throughout your entire body. Within 2 days, 74% of it is away from the site of injury. It goes to the liver, and it goes to the spleen, and it goes to the adrenals, and it goes to the ovaries, and it passes the blood-brain barrier and goes to the brain, and it goes into breast milk. It travels. It's probably one of the major components in this shedding phenomena. Okay, so this is you can't ignore it, although people are trying. Our health officials are trying. So, well, what does it take to actually recall a product from market if it has these health dangers? And so Vioxx here was recalled after it was on the market for 5 years. It had as many as 6,636 reports by that point, compared to the same time period here when the analysis was on 28,532 deaths. This is deaths associated with that. Now we know that hundreds of thousands of people had died of Vioxx in reality, but that was all it took. And that's the worst case scenario. Like the polio vaccine, after 10 deaths, it was removed from the market. Some of these, diethylstilbestrol, 213 deaths. This is passed on cancer to even the children of the people that took diethylstilbestrol. Thalidomide, we have so many examples in the past that had we had this going on, what we have now, then we'd say that this is misinformation. These would not even be looked at. People would dismiss that. Our standards have changed.
Yeah, Dr. Pelech, that Vioxx, is it true that they took that off and then they rebranded it and then they put it into a third world country?
This is in the United States. I can't answer that question. I'm not sure myself. I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, because that happens, because it all to do with for example, Canada got the Johnson & Johnson, the AstraZeneca vaccine. And now hardly anybody uses it. In fact, even the Johnson & Johnson is not in favor. These were adenovirus vaccines, so they're delivering genetic material. But with those, there was much higher rates of thrombosis and vaccine injury that actually the United States never approved the AstraZeneca vaccine. And that's why it was only 3 there. If they had the AstraZeneca, those injuries would be even higher. In Canada, we approved it, but we already knew there was at least a dozen countries in Europe that rejected it based on the safety data. So, and in fact, what's interesting is if you look at the negotiation of the vaccines in Canada, they were negotiated in the summer of 2020, and the government committed to buying these. But in fact, it hadn't been approved by Health Canada until late November. So the government went ahead and bought all this, committed to it, before it even knew that it was actually a safe product by their own scientists. Okay, and what's interesting is because of the vaccine hesitancy, we've destroyed $1 billion worth of vaccine at the end of last year because people weren't taking them and they officially expired their shelf life. So,
can I say something too?
Yeah.
I'm an American scientist.
Mm-hmm.
2 dissertations, 1 PhD in biology, but different type of biology. So in the U.S., this is why I stood up. I have half family members, but I'm against this particular vaccine,
right.
RNA. And in the US, they did have the Johnson available, which is very different
That's right.
ingredients. And also reacts differently. Now, it is a higher risk, like you mentioned.
Right.
Our son, who is young, crossed the border on his American passport, walked back across because we are very against the RNA for anyone young, and we travel. So you couldn't get into another country without it. And he was fined by the federal government $5,700. And we had to appear in court 3 times. And I think the saving grace was that his father wrote and had a scientific journal, and prior to him crossing, he had a medical certificate saying he has allergies to the RNA because it's very hard on the gut for many people.
That's right.
And only on that, we ended up winning the case.
Yeah.
But they are different ingredients.
They are, yeah.
And
Oh,
they
yeah.
work differently.
That's right. The adenoviruses, they deliver DNA. From DNA, you can make multiple copies of the RNA, so you get much higher levels of spike protein. And if the spike protein is the pathogenic protein that's causing a lot of the vaccine injury, then you're going to have even bigger response with that. And that's what we see, and higher rates of thrombosis. So in fact, in BC, we continued to use the Johnson & Johnson's product, even though in Ontario, they decided that with about a 1 in 50,000 risk of thrombosis, they stopped doing it. But in BC, we continued. Yeah. But I think now the trend has been that the adenovirus vaccines, the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson, people really aren't using this anymore. But for a while, they were mixing them, which was not recommended by the manufacturers at all. Mind you, they wouldn't recommend it, but it was also not recommended by the World Health Organization. But we went ahead and did that. So I wanted to just give you one example of these vaccine injuries. Originally, Pfizer has to collect the data after their product is on the market. People report to them, doctors and all that. They have to consolidate that data, and then they have to present it to the FDA in the United States. And what happened is they didn't want to release this data. And it was the citizens that actually went to court, and the FDA, first they said it was going to take 55 years to provide that data, and then they said it was going to take 75 years, but the judge said you got 8 months. So that 350,000 pages of injury data, and just reading the section of the listing, it goes, I think it was around 9 pages, just listing the 1,235 different diseases that have been linked to the vaccine within 2 months of its release to the general public. That had documented 1,223 deaths, so they could link directly to that vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine. So we knew in the Pfizer study that there was a 300% increase compared to the placebo group of vaccine injury, but severe injury was a 75% increase. So what that means is, if you were to take the general public and you were to run those, and we get these kind of numbers in the VAERS system, it'd be easily 100 times the number of reports that the VAERS system shows, which kind of supports the idea that in the VAERS system, you really do need to take those numbers and multiply them probably by at least tenfold. Okay. So with the vaccine, with myocarditis, this is really interesting because early studies tried to look at myocarditis in all age groups, but eventually it became very clear, originally with an Israeli study, that the risks were getting close to about 1 in 6,000. The numbers vary depending on the study, but for males with a second shot of a Moderna or Pfizer vaccine, it was starting to around 1 in 5,000 risk of having symptomatic myocarditis. Okay, but the BC Centre for Disease Control is actually published recently on this, and I've reviewed the data, and interestingly, for the Pfizer vaccine, for 12 to 28-year-olds, the risk for the second shot of a Pfizer vaccine, if you're a male, is 1 in 1,600. And for some strange reason, they don't have the data for the Moderna vaccine for the 12 to 18-year-olds, which is, we know, is actually worse than the Pfizer. Okay? And many studies are now showing that for every case of symptomatic myocarditis or pericarditis, which is the damage in the muscle around the heart, there's probably 3 asymptomatic cases of myocarditis. There was a study that was done a few months ago in Thailand, Bangkok study, and they tested 12 to 18-year-olds. There was 300 of these students that were in the trial, and they actually monitored after the second shot of the Pfizer vaccine whether or not they had any heart damage. And it turned out there was 201 of them were males. 7 out of the 201 males actually had asymptomatic myocarditis or pericarditis. They didn't know, but the damage from measuring a heart protein called troponin and MRI to visualize, they could see the damage in the hearts of these kids. And since then, there's been more studies. And so it looks like about 30% of kids that are vaccinated have heart damage. Now, we don't know whether that's permanent in those studies, but we do know about myocarditis in general and how it works. So with myocarditis, this is actually where you have these long muscle cells, myocytes, and immune cells are actually infiltrating where those muscle cells are, and they're attacking those cells and killing those cells. Now, many of the cells of your body can regenerate, but the neurons in your brain and the cardiomyocytes do not regenerate. They're replaced by scar tissue. So just like when you're exercising, you can make your muscles bigger. Well, now that heart has to pump that blood through your circulation. The only way it can do it is to have the surrounding muscle cells get bigger. When you have larger muscle cells, the whole heart gets bigger. When the whole heart gets bigger and a person's very stressed, or they're really exercising, the blood pressure goes up. Plus, there's also, with this kind of myocarditis, you can have, depending upon the regions that are affected, you can get what's called arrhythmia. So then you may have a situation where the heart isn't beating in unison to pump the blood through, it's actually pumping against itself. And then the oxygen level doesn't go in the blood, your brain gets deprived, and you collapse. So myocarditis is not reversible. Now, people have argued that, oh, well, it's just a mild case of myocarditis. They're talking about the symptoms. We're not talking about the underlying damage. I'll take your question.
Can I just ask, are kids who are less active not as likely to suffer that?
Kids that have been vaccinated?
No, kids who are less active, yes, kids who are vaccinated.
That's right.
If they're less active,
likely
are
to
they
have
more-
an episode now. But that doesn't mean that in their future that there isn't on a road to cardiovascular disease. Because after cancer, the number 2 killer, and it's only different by about 1% or 2%, is cardiovascular disease, stroke and heart attacks. And that comes from increased blood pressure and a number of facts. So what we know is that when, maybe I should have pointed out here, when we know that with symptomatic myocarditis, the lethality rate, and this is from viral myocarditis, it's actually 20% death after 6 years. Okay, so we have no idea what this means with respect to vaccine-induced myocarditis. But people have argued that, well, if you get COVID, you have a higher risk of getting myocarditis. That's not borne by the data at all. In fact, the latest I've seen, you have to vaccinate over 70,000 people of that age to prevent a person from getting myocarditis. So, but 1 in 1,600 that get vaccinated will get symptomatic myocarditis. So you're 100 times more likely, in that order of magnitude, to get myocarditis from the vaccine than you are in that age group from the virus. I hope that's clear.
Should we not be testing kids with that?
Yes, we should have done it in the clinical studies in the first place. So well, how can this happen? And here's a study that was published late last year, where they had a person that was a patient that had Parkinson's disease, and what had happened is that this person had died 3 weeks after they had their third shot, so it was clearly a vaccine-induced injury, and the pathologist, this is a German pathologist, Dr. Moltz, he went and he looked to see, he looked in the brain. The individual had spike protein in their brain. But what was interesting, they also had spike protein in their heart. This is immunohistochemistry, and what you see, that little orange, or that reddish, that is the production of the spike protein in this person's heart. And the blue is actually immune cells that are now infiltrating to attack that. And here, just to make clear, this spike protein isn't from a virus infection. This is the immunohistochemistry done with the nucleocapsid protein, and there's no nucleocapsid protein. This person clearly had a vaccine-induced production of spike protein in their heart that their own immune system was attacking. Exactly how myocarditis would occur. So I'm coming to a conclusion, hopefully a good conclusion, and then we can take more questions. But we've all heard about these cases of people that are athletes collapsing in the field during practices or during actual matches. And then one can only imagine, not only are these athletes exerting themselves, but they're highly stressed. They want to win. There's so much on the line. And that's just a recipe then for these people that have underlying, tissue damage in their hearts to actually collapse. And what we're seeing is about a 10 times higher average in terms of reports of collapses of athletes in the field. The blue is the number of reports here, and in total we've got about 1,179 that they could find in the media. But of those, most die. The red is deaths. The blue is the collapses. So this is very lethal. And this is what upsets me, for example, at UBC. We insisted that anyone involved in sports had to be vaccinated. We didn't insist on this for the students in general, but we did insist on the athletes, people involved in social activities. Now we're insisting that all of the students that are going into the health profession at UBC get vaccinated. So now your healthcare workers, your future healthcare workers, are being subjected to this kind of potential damage. And if your healthcare providers are not healthy, how are they going to be able to take care of you? And at the same time, we've let go so many nurses that had natural immunity, that were well protected. And we saw thousands of healthcare workers that were fired, and we're now trying to recruit nurses from other countries, which means that we're probably exacerbating the problems they have in those countries as well.
That's only BC.
That's only BC, that's right. So, so it does get worse before it gets better. So as I mentioned, the ovaries is one of the major sites of accumulation. And when a woman is born, a baby girl, she has all the oocytes that she's going to have for the rest of her life are all there. And when she actually has her first period, she will be able to have about 400 more periods. Each period, 1 or 2 oocytes is converted into a fertilizable egg. And many women are putting off when they're having their babies. We know that there is damage. We know that the spike protein can go, the lipid nanoparticles that have the gene for the spike protein can accumulate in the ovaries. We also know that 40% of women that are vaccinated have menstrual issues. Heavier bleeding or prolonged bleeding, which tells you that there's something wrong with the hypothalamus and the pituitary and the ovary. This hormonal axis that controls the menstrual cycle is actually being affected. So it's likely it's probably at the level of the brain and the ovaries. But if you have damage to those ovaries, those oocytes that are lost are not replaced, and what it means that you will run out of oocytes sooner. So we may actually be in the future seeing, and we don't know, and I don't want to alarm people, but we need to know the answers to these questions before we start subjecting people to these kind of risks, especially pregnant mothers. So it may well be that people will end up going into menopause much faster. Okay, I'll take your question.
Well, so I have
please.
Okay, so we'll come back to question period.
Yeah, we're gonna
Yeah.
hold off on questions for now. I should have announced that. I apologize.
Sure.
So finish your presentation and then we'll take Q&A.
So not only are the men having these issues, the women, but the men too. Male sperm counts have dropped 15% after vaccination. They do recover after about 3 months. There has been a general decline in sperm counts and motility and mobility and viability for the last 30 years, but only about 0.5 to 1% per year in those parameters. But we're seeing a 15% drop. So we're seeing an overall drop actually in number of child births in 2022 compared to previous years. There's a number of reasons that could explain that, but this could be one part of it. So we're actually seeing that the total number of deaths that occurred in 2020 was actually not that much different from 2019. But in 2021, and now especially 2022, we're seeing increased all-cause mortality. Now, there may be a number of reasons for that, but it's not due to COVID-19 itself. The virus does not account for the excess mortality that we're seeing in here. This would be the COVID deaths in blue, the last year and a half. And the red is increased in all-cause mortality. The excess all-cause mortality is as much as, depending on the time, typically between 10 to 25%, depending upon the month. And this is not just BC or Canada. This is actually worldwide. in the countries that are the most highly vaccinated. The countries that are the least vaccinated, for example, those in Africa, where you have about half the population vaccinated, is actually doing much, much better. They have much lower death rates from COVID-19, probably because they have natural immunity. So here's then the good news. So if we look at the accumulated numbers and percentage of people in Canada who've received a vaccine by age groups, of course, the vaccines were only approved more recently for 5-year-olds and under. But over the last 6 months, the adoption of vaccination, basically in the up to 4-year-olds, is 4.2%. Parents are not vaccinating their young toddlers. And it's about 10% for 5 to 11-year-olds, and it's about the same. In fact, it's right up to the 30-year-olds and under, that's 10%, 15% for 30 to 39-year-olds. It's only the elderly people that are more than 50% have had a shot in the last 6 months. And actually, that's remarkably low, because this is actually the 46% in the 60 to 69 group. So people are vaccine hesitant for some reason. Right. So I think, my colleagues and others, we're being effective. And we're spreaders of misinformation. And there's a war going on right now that a huge amount of resources are being spent basically to fight misinformation. So the information that I provided to you today, which was from primary scientific literature and even from the documents from the clinical studies and also from agencies like the BC Center for Disease Control, that I can't present you that information. You won't see it in mainstream media. If I was to post it on certain platforms, it's immediately removed. And despite that, this is sort of the compliance that we're seeing now. And if we look at how the provinces are doing in the last 6 months for getting their booster shots, this is the Canadian average is 26%. Now these vaccines don't work after 4 months at the most, right? So all these people effectively are unvaccinated, if you can do that. If you've never been vaccinated, I don't like to say you're unvaccinated, I like to say you're non-vaccinated, because you can't undo something that never happened in the first place. So, but if you look here in Alberta, 16.6%. Yeah. Right? BC's the worst. Okay? I suppose Bonnie Henry would say BC's the best. Okay? And none of it, only 6% of the population, and in the Northwest Territories, about 15%. So people aren't getting vaccinated. And so you're going to see a lot more ads, a lot more money being spent to convince you, using very sophisticated nudging techniques, that you don't even realize how manipulated you're being. And there's going to be a big campaign using your taxpayer dollars to basically support this kind of activity. Now, you can say, well, Dr. Pelech, you're not really presenting the right information, and you misunderstand the information, and you're being very selective in what you picked. But bear in mind that in many other countries now, including Australia, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, United Kingdom, and the list goes on, they no longer recommend, and in some cases they will not offer vaccines to anyone who's under 12. And those are public health regulatory agencies making those decisions. So what is it that they know that Theresa Tam or Bonnie Henry, doesn't know? And in Denmark, they don't recommend vaccination of anyone under 50. And in Australia, they don't recommend now vaccination of anyone under 40. Okay, so it's becoming clearer and clearer, the situation. So that's where I'll bring it to a close. Thank you very much. And hopefully this will be informative.
Okay, we're not done with you yet. Look out, big guns. Okay, first question. And you might have in part answered some of these questions, but
Sure.
if you want to elaborate further, that's fine. So first one, if a pregnant woman gets the vax, how does it affect her unborn child?
That's a very good question. We don't know enough. But what I will tell you is there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that there could be increased stillborns, but there's not any data in the literature to support that at this time. So I don't know about that. I did review a publication for a meta-analysis of over 37 studies of the outcomes of pregnancy in vaccinated women. And the observation was quite interesting. It's kind of funny, the paper, the report kind of worded it this way, that there was a slight premature birth to women that were unvaccinated compared to vaccinated, which I challenge in that, well, if they're unvaccinated, isn't that normal? So there's a slight delay in people who've been vaccinated that actually have child. Now, as it turns out, the statistical significant data that's reoccurring is that there's increased, maybe 10% of gestational diabetes in the vaccinated group compared to the unvaccinated group. And in addition, there is about a 10% increase in C-sections in the vaccinated group compared to the unvaccinated group. And so it looks, and that makes sense, you know, if you're a slight delay in the baby, if you've got a bigger baby because of gestational diabetes, there might be more of a trend to the C-sections. But this is statistically significant, and it's been observed in multiple studies. So I think that's real. Now, the argument was that the vaccines, that there was less COVID cases in the women that were vaccinated compared to the vaccinated group. But this may actually be a sampling bias, because if you're an unvaccinated woman and you're pregnant and you're dealing with your gynecologist, they're probably under tremendous pressure to get vaccinated, and they're probably being more monitored to see if they have COVID. So I think we may have a slight increase in COVID cases in unvaccinated simply because they're stressed out and they're told more to be tested more regularly, and that might account for the difference. Yeah, but as far as we can tell, the risks to a woman that is actually even had COVID, the outcomes are not really that much different than in the vaccinated population in terms of if they get COVID.
Do unvaccinated people have more car accidents?
Yeah, you heard about that one. Oh, there's so many things that are wrong with that study. And in fact, we're preparing a response to that. But, you know, firstly, they included people that were pedestrians, that were passengers in the car, that weren't driving the car. They had no no data in terms of how do you know these people were vaccinated or not that were driving the car. And then what was it? Was it the first shot, the second shot, the third shot? How soon after did they get vaccinated? Did they do that? Maybe these were people that had just gotten vaccinated and had brain fog. And, and had an accident, but because it wasn't within the first 2 weeks, they were considered unvaccinated. We can't tell. I mean, it turns out that the elderly people in that study that were vaccinated actually had more accidents, but we have less elderly people driving. They're not driving to work. They're not going to work at that age. So, and then the people with lower social economic situation, they have to drive greater distances, so they're more likely to actually have an accident, and they're also more likely not to get vaccinated, according to the statistics we have. So there's just so many parameters. Now that individual or that had a $50,000 grant from the government to support convincing people to get vaccinated. The actual grant that he had was for that purpose, to dissuade people from vaccine hesitancy. So this accident study has been ridiculed throughout the world. And so, no, I don't think there's anything to that.
Next question. Will unvaccinated blood be available for transfusions, and should we be worried about receiving vaxxed blood?
Yeah, a lot of people have been brought this up. The Canadian Blood Services, basically, if you've just been vaccinated that day, they're happy to take your blood. So you can, in principle, get blood that has lipid nanoparticles in it. However, the frequency by which that would occur would be very small, I would say, in terms of the time between shots of getting vaccinated. The lipid nanoparticles would be quite dilute spread through the body because the tissues would be taking up the lipid nanoparticles. So therefore, the actual amount that would be in the blood itself would be relatively low. So I don't think that it presents a major threat to anyone if they were receiving blood from someone who has been vaccinated, just simply because it's going to be quite dilute what they get. Now, the only scenario I could see that would be dangerous is if you had a situation where someone had been recently vaccinated or had COVID and their antibody levels were very high in the blood, and then the recipient for the blood transfusion is sick, they need to have an operation, and they are forced to get a vaccine shot in order to get care, maybe it could be a transplant or something, then they will be producing massive amounts of spike protein on their tissues. So now when they get this blood from somebody that's loaded with antibodies, it'll actually increase the immune response to attack those tissues. So in that scenario, I could see potential damage, but outside that, I think it's not something to be worried about.
Okay, next question. Will unvaxxed blood be available for transfusions? I'm sorry, as an unvaxxed person married to a triple vaxxed person, should I be concerned about shedding? Yeah, the shedding phenomenon is very interesting. It hasn't really been properly examined in any clinical study that I've seen. But I think it's a combination of three things. I think there's actually many things happening. Remember I told you that when you've just been vaccinated, you may have a heavier period or prolonged period. And women that hang out together with friends, their periods can synchronize. So there's something that's, whether it's a pheromone or something, we have not really put our finger on it, that actually their bodies sense
to create this kind of synchrony. Now, on top of that, I've already shown you that if you've just been vaccinated, you're more likely to actually get infected with the virus. So there's a chance that you're actually shedding virus. Secondly, it may be that these lipid nanoparticles themselves, because they can spread throughout the body, including into your salivary area, you may actually be spewing out lipid nanoparticles. Thirdly, when you have that tissue destruction going on from the immune system attacking the cells that are expressing the spike protein, you're generating these exosomes. These exosomes with the spike protein may be shed as well. So it's really hard to tell exactly what's going on, but I don't think it presents a health threat, because the concentration of the whatever it is, unless it's the virus, and most people have antibodies, I don't really think it's high enough to be of concern, this shedding phenomena. And that includes sexual intercourse. People have asked me that question before, and I don't think that there's that much that would be in, let's say, the semen that would have lipid nanoparticles, let's say. It's going to be very, very dilute. Plus, it has to be able to pass through into the actual, being basically in the womb itself environment. It's an acidic environment. It probably destroys the lipid nanoparticles. I think that's pretty safe as well.
Next question. Have you heard of any way to detox your body of the vax and its side effects?
Yeah, people have proposed things in nattokinase, and I don't know what to make out of that. The problem is that you have a very specific protein that's expressed on the surface of your cells, and you actually have 20,000 different proteins being produced by your own genes in your own cells, and many of them are on the surface of cells. So I think the detoxification occurs naturally. That's exactly what your immune system is trying to do, is to attack the cells that have the spike protein and digest the protein into little pieces and eradicate it. So I think naturally, as long as you have a very good immune system, it will naturally cleanse your body. Now, the argument is, well, should you be doing fasting and increase autophagy? Well, that might be generally helpful for just diseases in general, but you have to be careful, because you also need to have, your immune system is very active, and it reproduces itself, and so if you don't have the right nutrients, then you're going to compromise your immune system. So there's a fine balance between like fasting too much, but I think the reality is you should be doing the things that you should normally be doing, which is to eat a healthy diet, lower your stress, get your sleep, and allow your body's natural processes to occur to cleanse yourself. I don't think there is a magic bullet to take out just this spike protein. There has been concern about the gene that, yes, the RNA, we thought that it would be like degraded, and it is slowly. The modifications that have occurred with the RNA make it so that it doesn't degrade as quickly, and so therefore you can produce more spike protein, but eventually it does degrade. But there is evidence in at least 2 studies with cells in culture that are liver cells, that the RNA can be converted to DNA, and that DNA can be found in the nucleus of cells with the rest of the genome. Now you have to understand that when we're saying we're altering your genome, it's such a tiny change in your genome. Your genome is 2.9 billion base pairs or letters long. And so the number of letters we're talking about here is 30,000 letters. And if it's for the virus, and if it's for the spike protein alone that would be in the vaccine, that RNA, it's basically like 4,000 nucleotides compared to 2.9 billion nucleotides in your genome. It's such a tiny change. It's very inconsequential. And I think that how often that RNA might be converted to DNA by this line 1 enzyme, this reverse transcriptase, I would imagine it's actually fairly rare. So I'm not worried about a person's genome being altered, and it doesn't integrate into the genome. It'll be a separate piece of DNA, and we don't even know if that DNA will be able to replicate. So as time goes on, it may just have natural degradation. So I'm not too worried about it myself.
Okay, doctor, morticians and embalmers reports. Please give us an update on that.
Okay, well, Canadian Code Care Alliance, we had a meeting with John O'Toole, the mortician that was in the Suddenly Death video, that where he was one of those, he's a funeral director in the United Kingdom, and we also talked to Richard Hirschman, and our panel, we actually heard their presentation. They showed us the videos of what they had, and we asked a lot of questions, and we are going to be posting that interview on the Canadian COVID Care Alliance website shortly. I think these are credible individuals. I think they're sincere individuals. They certainly they're not scientists, and they're the first to admit it, but they can only talk about their personal experience. And so what they're seeing is that there's a higher rate, they claim, in more vaccinated people than they've seen before, of white calamari-like clots that they're pulling out of the bodies of people. It's not everybody, and they see it in some people that are not vaccinated as well, but there's a higher frequency in the vaccinated people. We have independently talked to a number of pathologists that have been, surgeons that are dealing with cardiovascular disease, and they don't seem to see this phenomenon. But there's a survey that was done by these individuals of about 100 morticians, and they say that about 70% of those morticians have seen the same thing. So it's still kind of controversial. I think there's something there. They're certainly pulling out these massive clots. What we don't know in the Canadian COVID Care Alliance is whether these are post-mortem artifacts. That means that these changes occur in the body after a person's dead, and whether the spike protein is actually facilitating the production of these, which is a viable hypothesis. There are some individuals, Dr. Ryan Coleman, who in fact can mimic some of these events by adding spike protein to blood in solution. So it's possible, but it's a phenomenon that we don't understand it, but there may very well, it does appear to be happening. So, and they've got the clots to show it. Yeah, so that's all I can say in that right now. But you can hear the interview and you can hear what these individuals have to say.
Next one. Africa had only 6% vaccine penetration with no excess mortality. North America has 80 to 90% of the population vaccinated and huge increases in all-cause mortality. Can you comment, please?
Yeah, the more vaccinated you are, the higher the rates of COVID cases. And that was known from a Harvard study early on where they had looked at, I think it was around 1947 counties in the United States. They did a correlation between vaccination rates and COVID cases. And they also looked at 68 countries. And either there was no correlation, or in those countries that were most vaccinated, there was a correlation, a positive correlation. The more vaccinated, the more COVID cases. So in Africa, you know, like South Africa, you have 52% of the population is vaccinated. Actually, the Americans are less vaccinated than we are by about 10%. But again, we've got these complications about what constitutes a case because of false positives and incentives to report cases in the U.S. But I think that, I mean, the most telltale sign I can think of is India. So in May and June of 2021, they had a massive spike of COVID cases and deaths, unlike anything that they had seen before that. By that point in the population, it was less than 10% vaccinated. You know, the irony, the country that's producing the most vaccines actually had one of it wasn't there for their population. It was for North America and Europe. So, but anyways, but what was striking was that as dramatic as that peak was, by July 1st, it was back down. So without vaccination, without maybe ivermectin possibly helped, it came right down. So, and it's only started increasing again as their population vaccinated again. So I think that the data is, there's really no data to support that increasing the vaccination in your population is reducing the deaths and COVID cases and hospitalizations in that population.
Please comment on Sweden. What did they get right? What did they get wrong?
Yeah, Sweden was a really unique case because they did not introduce the measures that we did. They didn't do the lockdowns, they didn't do the masking, they kept the businesses open, they kept the schools open. And they were criticized in the first year because there was a slight increase in the deaths per capita. But over the last 3 years, they actually have done much better than the surrounding Scandinavian countries that had much more severe restrictions, which, as you can tell, they're completely lifting now on these vaccinations and passports and all that. So Sweden didn't destroy their economy. They kept pretty much their lifestyle the same. They did encourage vaccination for a while, but now, as you can see they don't recommend it for under 12, and I'm sure because the people in Denmark are no longer recommending under 50, I'm pretty sure in Sweden they'll probably do the same.
Does Bill C-36 affect?
Bill 36.
Bill 36, does it affect patient-doctor confidentiality?
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't bring all the bad things about this bill, but one of them is that if you were a patient with a doctor and somebody reported that doctor is doing something that contravened what the college has stipulated, and as I said, who it is that's going to be running the college is appointed positions, not elected positions. And bear in mind that the person who's really calling the shots, and certainly now, is going to be Adrian Dix. Adrian Dix has no scientific background, never mind, medical background. And so it's his decisions that are basically telling what competent physicians and other people in their health-related areas should be doing. But one of these guidelines is that basically if you're under investigation, the college can come to your office unannounced without any warrants and seize the patient records and take them away. And then that violates the patient-doctor relationship. And that will be, that's part of Bill 36.
Are they planning on vaccinating livestock, and how does this affect humans?
Yeah. Yes, they are. They're already starting to do that. Lipid nanoparticles in livestock. as I said, these 200 vaccines that are in development, I was talking about humans, but there's lots of these vaccines because the technology is relatively cheap and fast, that they're actually are doing it. Now the question is, are you at risk if you consume the products? Maybe the milk, you might have some lipid nanoparticles, but they do pasteurize the milk. I think that might affect, I don't know, the properties of lipid nanoparticles. You have to remember that these lipid nanoparticles, when they were first being introduced, they had to be kept frozen because they were only stable for about 2 hours at room temperature. How they could last for days at 37 degrees in your body, I don't understand. But in principle, you could have the transfer in dairy products, like milk products, of lipid nanoparticles. I suppose it'll be a way of keeping the population inoculated, boosted.
How does Dr. Pelech escape being canceled and be allowed to keep working at UBC?
Well, some of my colleagues probably had that same question. But, you know, I mean, I'm actively doing COVID research. I've already published in the area multiple publications. I've been running this big trial. I'm tenured. I'm near retirement. My publication record as a scientist would put me in the top 4% in the world. So as a result, it's really hard for someone to say that he doesn't know what he's talking about. And we've tried to actually have open debates with other individuals that have been pushing the mainstream narrative. I think one particular individual who's done a lot of damage is Professor Timothy Caulfield. And some of you may have seen the Vancouver Sun article about a year ago where they interviewed me, and they because of my connection with the Canadian COVID Care Alliance, it was to deal with misinformation. So this is a year ago. And they decided to interview Professor Caulfield at the same time. And basically he made it clear that he didn't think that it was a good idea to debate spreaders of misinformation because it just gives them a platform to get that information out. But he's been very active. He is actually one of the panel members that's on this report that just came out from the Council of Canadian Academies, a very large, detailed report that basically is saying that they need to step up the efforts on preventing misinformation. And he's a member. I call him Professor Caulfield because he has a bachelor's degree in science, but he's actually, his degrees are in law. He's a lawyer. But he has a TV or some sort of TV program and social media, and he's highly interviewed by CBC and other outlets. And he's on a crusade to basically prevent people like me to tell you what I know. And so we would like to have a little debate with him. Byron Bridle has issued many challenges to him. He doesn't reply to Dr. Bridle, but that's where we're at. So sorry, I've really gone a long ways from your question, but I'm kind of insulated. I'm also on the University of BC Senate. So my senators do not appreciate every time I bring up, why are we masking? Why are we vaccinating? But I won't shut up until basically my term is over. Yeah.
Was all of your research and studies done at UBC or on your own time and through a different company?
I'm in a very unique situation in that I support my academic research with the proceeds from my company. And so I really use my company as a means to do academic research and support the research in companies and other university labs around the world. We've done work with about 2,000 labs in 35 countries. So everything that I do that's kind of company-related research is really academic research. We're trying to answer the same questions. And because I'm a basic researcher, I'm not trying to produce products. Although we have come up with observations. For example, we filed with my UBC connections a patent, UBC insisted on this, that there's a drug that actually interferes with the ability of the SARS-CoV-2 virus to replicate. It seems to work quite well. It's tested on cells and culture in the level 4 Finder facility at UBC. I'm now working on another drug that serendipitously, for a different application for ALS research, may in fact have application for interfering with the replication of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So we're working on that now too, and we have some very interesting results.
What do you see as the long-term effects on the population as a whole because of this pandemic-induced mass vax experiment?
I'm afraid that I think statistically we'll have very little impact. I think the number of people who can have severe injury that was non-repairable is probably around 1 in 500. So when you consider the entire size of our population, there is going to be periods where we have increased morbidity and mortality, but I think overall, the data so far looks as though a relatively small number of people are severely affected in terms of their health by this, that we will recover, we will get over it. But at the back of my head, I keep thinking about if we continue with this technology, if we don't bring it to an end, then we may in fact make it much, much worse down the road, and there'll be a lot more people harmed. So I see two big problems here. One, gain-of-function research. I think it's pretty clear at this stage of the game that the SARS-CoV-2 virus was released, I would like to think accidentally, from the Wuhan facility in China, and it was genetically engineered in that facility. And it's gain-of-function research. And the explanation for why this research is being done, that's being given, is that, well, if we can identify mutations in these proteins that make them more, in the proteins of these pathogens that make them more virulent, then if these occur in nature, we can recognize that there is a threat there. But I see this as like having an industry of nuclear weapons. The more expertise that's out there about this, the more likely that it'll be used for clandestine purposes. And I don't see any real advantage with the technology that we have today. If we have a pathogen that's out there, and we know that a particular strain is more deadly, we just have to sequence the strain and we'll know. We don't need to muck around and try to make these. Now what's happened is, for example, in Boston University last year, not that long ago, they took part of the genome of using the spike protein that was from the Wuhan strain and combined it with mutations that they see in the Omicron strain. So they created a version of the virus that's more deadly and more infectious. Okay, so the question is, well, why do you want to do that? Why are you doing? Why is this going on in a university lab? Did they have ethics approval to do this experiment? So the problem is that this is becoming seen as routine, normally done. I've sat in on conferences
with, Genome Canada, where they're talking about how great it will be to do these mutations to see if we can identify these problematic mutations in these pathogens so we can identify in the field if there's a threat there. This is gain-of-function research. So that's, to me, a huge threat, because we could repeat exactly what we've been through for the last 3 years with yet another virus. And then the other problem, of course, is I don't know what the long-term consequences are of these lipid nanoparticles when your own immune system is attacking your own tissues, causing damage throughout your entire body, and basically a mechanism that is essentially how you develop autoimmune diseases. So I know it takes a long time for autoimmune diseases to really develop, but myocarditis is an example of an autoimmune disease. And it occurs at pretty high frequency in young men, and women have that maybe 7 to 8 times less risk than males of that age. But if you look at the BC Centre for Disease Control data, where they looked at the various age groups, after the 3rd shot and the 4th shot, then they're getting, they didn't do the 4th shot, but they had the 3rd shot, and they're getting in the 30-year-olds and older. Now they're seeing their risks of myocarditis are going up. So it's not just restricted to young men.
Does garlic help with COVID?
I can't answer that question. I have no idea. Yeah.
Is it
But
true?
garlic is very tasty.
Yeah, very tasty. And hopefully you have it in a group. Is it true that during surgeries in BC, patients are being vaxxed against their will while they are under?
It is.
Yeah, I can't, that would be very surprising to me.
It's happening.
Yeah,
It's happening.
With the nurse.
yeah.
It is happening.
Yeah, I can't tell. I would be surprised, because that really violates the code of ethics. You have to be informed consent. So the government decides that if you've gotten vaccinated, you've agreed to get vaccinated. So that's basically what they're saying. You should do it with informed consent, but they're not getting informed consent. But their argument in the courts is that if you put yourself there to get vaccinated, but if you're unconscious and they do that without your permission, that's a different story.
They have a tagging system. She's telling me, I'm trying to get her to be a whistleblower for Rebel. They're working on it. They've been working on it for 2 months.
Okay, we need microphones on these people, please.
Yeah. So the question is that people that are patients in hospital that are unconscious are actually getting vaccinated against their will.
Yes.
And I can't comment on that because I have no information to support it either way.
Okay, next question. Why are the PCR tests still being endorsed when clearly we know they are not accurate?
Well, I asked that question to Mel Craigden of the BC Centre for Disease Control, and his argument is that it's so important that we identify if someone is active with COVID that they would rather err on the side of having a high rate of false positives so we can catch that individual that actually has the virus at that time to prevent them from spreading it.
That's so stupid.
It is, in my opinion, yes. Yeah. Especially now.
Yeah.
What do I do to recover my sense of smell that I lost after getting Omicron over 9 months ago?
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know, the symptoms that you have from a vaccination and from COVID-19 are almost the same. In fact, you have a higher rate of having symptoms if you're vaccinated than if you get infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. But one of the distinguishing features is this loss of smell or taste. But it is recoverable, and the reason is it probably involves nerve damage, and nerve damage takes much longer to recover than typical tissue damage, like to a muscle or a tendon or something like that. That's just the way it is with nerves.
Would it be useful for your company or other CCCA scientists to compare myocarditis or other spike protein-induced injuries in the vax versus the unvaxxed population?
Well, that has been, people have been trying to do it. Unfortunately, the clinical studies that people do this, they actually take data from a totally different study to then compare their data. For example, vaccine-induced myocarditis with COVID-induced, they actually don't do it in the same study with the same population group. So it's very expensive to do these studies, and we're just not equipped to do those. We can analyze those studies and see if they've been done properly and if there are flaws, and if they're really good studies, we can kind of identify that, but we just don't have the resources to do that.
Do you care to comment on what's happening with Dr. Peter McCullough or Dr. Hoff?
Well, you know, Dr. Hoff, I think, maybe what is it, next 8 days or something, he's actually under, I guess, a disciplinary review to whether he should be losing his license to practice medicine. He's such a dedicated individual. He's lost so much already, but he's not like backing down. It's not about the money. You know, he's made huge sacrifices because it's his inner nature to stand up to the oppression. And he's a man of high integrity, and he cares about his patients. And so he'll stand up for them. And certainly many people in our community are standing up for Dr. Hoff, too. So I'm involved in about 20 court cases as an expert witness. And so I write expert reports, and sometimes, you know, I'm under cross-exam. But I've provided my expert reports to Dr. Hoff and to Dr. Daniel Nagassi. So, and I'll be there if they need me to be a witness in their cases, if in fact, you know, it's asked for. Yeah.
What can we do?
To help Dr. Hoff? Well, you know, I think it's one of those things where, you know, letters to the editor, talking to other people and letting them aware of how individuals like this are, the attempt to muzzle them or prevent them from actually practicing their craft that, you know, they've been doing for decades. There has to be public outrage. And, you know, it's kind of interesting. When you look at the mainstream media, the reporters, they want these stories. They are starting to respond. Well, I'm seeing this with my colleague, Dr. Patrick Provost, who's actually on the Canadian COVID Care Alliance Committee, but he was suspended for 4 months, basically for telling the same sort of thing that I'm telling you, without pay at Laval University. But his union is backing him, and a lot of his colleagues are backing him. We need to see more of the medical profession, the doctors, and there are doctors that are looking out for him, and we need to be more vocal. But what I was saying with the media, they don't want to publish anything that's going to be...
Well, they're bought and paid for, so.
Well, that's basically it. Yeah. They're the major benefactors for them at this point in an industry that's floundering is government funding, government advertising for the vaccines, and from pharmaceutical companies with their advertising. And so the reporters want to tell these stories, but the senior management is blocking it. And I know this to be a fact because I've talked to many CBC reporters on this, and some of them have since resigned for CBC. But on the other hand, if it bleeds, it reads. So the population wants these stories. And
So the editors are in a kind of a quandary, because if you start to have a situation where your readerships are now disappointed that you're not actually doing your job, they'll lose their readership. If they lose their readership, then these other people aren't going to give them any money because they don't have much of a voice anymore. So as we see more information comes out, and it becomes clearer and clearer, then I think you will see a shift in the mainstream media, because if they don't, they're going to lose their market.
Like Fox News.
Yeah, Fox News is a good example. They've really had a drop in their viewership.
Dr. Pelech, could you introduce your friend over here?
Yes, yeah, come on up.
Come on up. Can we get a mic on this guy, please?
So,
Let me near a mic too.
so Mel, it's good to see you. You came a long ways.
Yes, I left.
He wandered around for a while, but he finally found us, so we're happy he's here.
It was that glow.
Yes, the glow.
Sorry?
No accident on the way. No accident.
Are you vaccinated?
I did the first time. And that gets to a point I think you people need to know, is that these sites vary incredibly in terms of the toxicity. And being on the North Shore, the main injection site was the old ICBC exhaust testing thing. So it was perfect. You could just drive in there. And when I went in there were people a lot older than me that would basically had this panic in their face that they had to get that shot. And, you know, the crutches were going, and I thought, you know, what is the big hurry? Because even at that time, there were questions about it. The one that got me was that this elderly gent passed out. And of course, nobody knew whether he died or whatever. They were totally oblivious to the fact that the guy was lying on the floor, and they were stepping over because they had to get that shot. So the end result is, having practiced on the North Shore since May of '70, when I started working at Lionsgate Hospital, I knew a lot of patients and friends and colleagues that said to me, Boucher, you are smoking the wrong grass, because I do not know anybody that's had an adverse effect, nor do I know any family members or anything else. And I think that is true. The incidence of serious adverse effects on the North Shore, because most of them were done at that injection site near Pemberton in North Van. Compare that to Charles Hoff that we were just talking about. I don't think he actually injected people. He was desperate not to, but Bonnie targeted him and said, you make sure you inject the indigenous. Now that's basically Lillooet and Lytton Band. They're very small in numbers. They're very rich because they get paid every time CN or CP goes by. But when you look at the side effects that those patients of his had, they were catastrophic. And Laura Lynn Thompson first interviewed him, and if you remember, I remember distinctly there was a couple gentlemen that were convulsing nonstop, like 24 hours a day. I mean, if you can imagine grand mal seizures, they were still alive, but they were literally on the floor. I meant to ask him, because one of those guys, about a month later, was interviewed, and he was actually sitting up in a wheelchair, and he was having the odd seizure, but compared to what he was before, the question was, I'm pretty sure that Charles said he did treat him with ivermectin, but these batches are so different. I mean, they are analyzed analyze, and they're not only different from one batch of Pfizer, they're different than Moderna, they're different than J&J, whatever. So it really is a crapshoot as to what you get. And of course, that gets back to the informed consent. There is no way that you get any informed consent.
He had 4 deaths, I think it was, right?
Absolutely. And they were catastrophic.
And from the vaccine injury, and that's what compelled him to write to Bonnie Henry, and that's what got him into trouble.
Absolutely. She does not like being questioned in any way, shape, or form. That's still coming to the head of the pile because she's increasingly getting sued. But so far, if I see her give that victory sign again when she walks into court, talk about waving a red flag.
You know, your point about the vaccines, people should understand that the lots that were tested on people initially with the interim authorization, they were much purer, actually. And once they got to the later lots that were more mass-produced, the purity, they had to be at least 50% pure. And so many of them were just on the borderline. And some people wonder whether the earliest vaccines even had anything in them, because that would result in less side effects and make it more likely that the population would take it. But, so there's a lot of questions about this. Dr. Maria Gucci on my Canadian COVID Care Alliance Scientific Medical Advisory Panel has done a fabulous job in actually looking at these vaccines and their formulations. And as you point out, it is a crapshoot.
Yeah,
and there are certain lots that are probably much worse. In fact, some of the lots in Japan, they actually found stainless steel that was in the injections, and they actually stopped taking that particular vaccine in Japan.
So I have a question here. I'll direct it to both of you.
Sure.
Would you as doctors still advise young people who do not want to be vaccinated to enter life sciences given the infiltration of certain attitudes that discourage freedom of choice, traditional morality, and a well-developed conscience?
I'll let you answer that first, Mel. I have an answer. Don't worry.
Well, unfortunately, I left my copy of Druthers in my car strategically, but you know the one I'm talking about, and that gets to the 80 doctors that died related to the vaccine. And when you look at those pictures, anytime I've showed that to anybody, they look and they say, my God, look at this one, 25, 27, 29. Those are residents. So getting back to your question, if I was thinking about medicine and they demanded that I be vaccinated, there's no way. I mean, that is an absolute no-no. And I think Steven could certainly speak
I think it's almost 100 people now, I think is what he's got.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
100 doctors or healthcare professionals?
No, these are all doctors.
All doctors.
Yeah.
All doctors. Initially, it was mainly Ontario, but when you look at the locale and the age now, a lot of them are residents, or they've just started in practice. They're in their 30s. And
Well, residents have the most rigorous schedule, don't they?
Well, you know,
depends on the specialty.
the fact checkers basically say, well, look, these people, some of them had cancer, some of them it was car accident, and they say it's unrelated. But if you're having injury, if you're having a heart attack while you're driving or something, how would you know? So just because it isn't as obviously linked, what we do know for a fact is that we're seeing a lot of the doctors dying at much higher frequency than we would expect. And you know, in terms of people being dissuaded to going in this profession, you know, when you've got about 10 applicants for medical school at UBC for every position, don't worry, there will be people that step up. But the thing about science is that it's self-correcting. As more data comes, scientists do not like to be on the wrong side
of the data. So when enough data is there, they get convinced. I don't know of any scientists that had concerns about this before that have now reviewed all the data that's available and have said, yeah, these vaccines are the best thing since sliced bread. No, it's the other way around. You have these skeptics initially, Dr. Malhotra, for example, John Campbell. You know, these people, they've gone through this whole journey, and their ranks are just increasing. They're not decreasing. So I think in the long run, we will learn a lot from these lessons, and it's a real opportunity to really improve our systems, build back better, but not the way they're thinking. Yeah.
Next question. Does blood type matter?
In what respect?
That's all we got here.
No, I don't think so. I don't see why it would. Yeah.
Not that I'm aware of.
I heard a while ago that if you have RH negative blood.
Oh, there is that RH, that's true. There is a link there, but I can't remember whether it's good or bad.
It was we're able to fight off COVID.
Better. Yeah. So the question was whether the RH factor for the blood typing, that you had a better prognosis with COVID-19. But I have not actually seen that particular study to critique it. I would think that it's probably still questionable. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to switch to the floor. Is it Matthew? If we could get a mic to Matthew.
I'm not speaking for my organization. I work for a large regulatory company. It's an insurance company that is supposed to regulate safe work in BC.
I wonder who that is.
I have no idea. I gotta ask a couple of questions. Number one about turbo cancer, number two about how we stop the shots. It seems to me we are well beyond the pale of crimes against humanity. In our organization of only 3,400 people, max 4,000, I have personally documented approximately 5 sudden deaths of what appears to be turbo cancer. 5 sudden deaths, including a doctor. We have neurological disorders, seizure disorders. We've had a young woman with 2 strokes and a heart attack, a person with a seizure in their hand, people with myocarditis and pericarditis joking about it, not understanding the severity, the seriousness of it. We've had spouse suicide. We've had all kinds of horrible conditions come out because of this mandate and the direct impact of the jab. The truth is, this seems to be a crime against humanity of the most egregious level. I cannot understand how we as a society in Canada can put up with the shots continuing. They are killing children. I mean, I heard about a 10-year-old with a heart attack just a couple days ago, and one of my good friends, I've just been in the hospital with her. She's just been released. She has massive clots in her lungs. And her life expectancy, I'm sure, is incredibly reduced. So I don't understand. Can we please comment on the turbo cancer and how come we can't get people to demand that these shots be stopped the same way they are in other countries?
Yeah.
Well,
there's nothing worse than a coincidental heart attack.
yeah.
Women often do not present in any way similar with symptoms that men do. So it's very easy to say, like diabetics, they may not have any chest pain at all. And so it's easy to say, well, it can't be a heart attack. It must be coincidental as they're dropping to the floor and dying. And this happens. So it's brainwashing, it's denial, it's everything, because when you think about it, psychosocially and every other way, these people, particularly doctors, are tied to this. That's their whole reputation. So in my class, there's one guy that agreed with me, and he was a bit of different character. He was a Greenpeace guy, and he died about a week before I could meet him. He phoned me out of the blue. I hadn't seen him for years, and he was a tragic case, but he knew all about this. And as I said, he's the only one in my class that has supported me. I do not have one golfer at Seymour that they're the Irish Mafia golfers. I know these guys. I grew, we've been playing golf together since I came to the North Shore. And not one of them, the head of neurosurgery, he'll come out. I think he's probably had a couple of shots
Excuse me, doctor,
himself.
excuse me. If some of you have to go, that's fine. Go to the kitchen. We have extra potatoes for you to take. In bags, okay? The other thing is, if you want to help with the recall in Vancouver Point Grey, please see Carol at the back. And if you want to sign the petition that was advertised earlier, please sign at the back. So don't forget your potatoes. Please continue, Doctor.
Okay, sorry, I don't want to hog the mic here, but I want to make a couple comments. One of my new heroes is a gentleman by the name of Alex Osario. He ended up being the main security for the truckers. He is a jack of all trades, and he's a tow truck driver. The point I want to make about that is the word goes through the industry very quickly. They have had an increase to 75% head-on crashes on the Coquihalla and the Hope Princeton. That is hugely increased. Now, how do you prove that? But if you're going head-on, all it takes is one of the individuals to have a stroke, have a heart attack, and they're going to be head-on. That same guy was driving down a main street in Surrey, and there was, just happened an accident, and he came on the scene. This young guy was slumped over the wheel. There was no impact. He had some sort of catastrophic, likely either heart or lung, that killed him. He was slumped over the wheel. There was no damage to the vehicle. There was no other vehicle near him. And Alex had just been talking about these head-on, and that's often what happens. How do you prove it? The only way you're going to prove it is autopsy. How many times are they going to do an autopsy? It's expensive, the family has to sign, they're already traumatized, et cetera, et cetera. Your comment, I think, is very apropos. We have to report these. It's estimated that VAERS in the US, 1% of serious adverse effects are reported. So that answers your question. My point is that VAERS Canada, that was designed by Don Hamagami, we all vetted that database. We added something to it. And he had the advantage. When I first met him, he said that he wanted to help me with data, and he had a number of friends in the business. We were lucky enough that he got some of the highest priced data people in the province to help him to fine-tune this. The problem was that it got so claustrophobic, they were paranoid about reporting people's private information. So I think they've solved the problem. What you people need to realize, that sort of stuff really has to be documented. It's a sensitive issue, but people increasingly are waking up.
Okay, so what can he do as a person? Calls MLA,
Yeah,
calls
MLA,
MP.
that's right.
What do you do?
All of them.
Concrete for this gentleman,
Yeah,
what can we do?
You have to speak to your family, your friends, colleagues. They may not want to hear from you at this point, but eventually it permeates, and eventually they hear enough from enough other people. And then, as I was showing you the statistics in terms of vaccine hesitancy,
people are listening, and they're wondering. And many of those people that are highly vaccinated, they are going to be extremely annoyed and angry. And so, you know, when the politicians get letters, every letter they get, they know it reflects many people, not just one. If you're willing to spend the time to contact them, they know that that's a hot button for a lot of people. The other is that the media, you know, contact, if you have these stories, get involved in organizations that are either action-orientated or even just getting information like the Canadian COVID Care Alliance. I did want to point out a couple of things from what you were saying there, Mel. So 3/4 of the people that report injury are female. So we know right off the bat that there is an underestimation in these reporting systems, because it should be the same. In fact, when COVID first happened and those deaths in Italy and all that, they were mainly males and elderly males. Many of them were doctors. So there is this factor at play, and people are just going to have to be more activist. And we have to demand better systems. You know, our governance is failing us, our healthcare system is failing us, our media is failing us, and our courts are failing us. Although I had a victory the other day, a 5-year-old girl, her mother did not want her to be vaccinated, her father, ex-husband wanted, and we won the case. The child did not have to get vaccinated. Yeah. So you have to fight them in all these areas.
So the other thing is go on Timothy Caulfield's
yeah. Give
Twitter
nasty
page.
Comments.
I've been blocked by him. You guys hop on and just present evidence, please.
Yeah.
Okay?
Tell them that you want to see a debate.
Timothy Caulfield blocked me.
Professor of law at the University of Alberta.
Yes.
Whose crusade is to fight misinformation.
Yes.
Yeah.
So get on their Twitter, get on their Facebook, get on their stuff. I've been blocked, so help me out, okay? And yeah, keep going. Who is the next hand? Well, it's his show, so.
Yes, please.
Microphone, please.
I'm wondering why I'm not finding any information from
Right up
doctors.
close, right up close.
I'm wondering why I'm not finding any information from doctors on why unvaxxed people, women in particular, who are having symptoms from being exposed to vaccinated partners, and the doctors are not wanting to talk about it.
You need to hold the microphone
Yeah,
right
so
by
the
your
question
mouth.
is,
Right here.
is about why is it that
Why is it that doctors, and I've been to about 6 of them around here, do not want to address the fact that unvaccinated women are being harmed by their vaccinated partners? They're having all kinds of clots going on. I know 2 women personally who have died from the husband getting vaccinated. The mother and the daughter died from
Really?
his vaccine. They're unvaccinated. I have seen one doctor who said he absolutely knew what he was looking at, but he wasn't going to put it in my file and he couldn't talk about it. So I'm wanting to know if there's anywhere, like you're doing research on this kind of stuff, is there a potential of having a research done with people who are unvaccinated who are actually are dying from being exposed to vaccinated people? And I'm hearing about more women than men. I'm not hearing what's going on for the men, but I'm knowing like tons of women who are being like dying and really hurt by their vaccinated partners.
Anecdotally, I've heard this. I mean, running a clinical study with 4,000 participants, I've actually talked directly to more than 1,000 of them, and they tell me stories, in part like yours. So I know the shedding phenomenon occurs, but we can't find anything in the scientific literature where anyone has decided to take on this problem. And usually what happens is...
Somebody doesn't want to take the blood work. If they don't want to do my blood work to find out if I'm having nanoparticles in my body because I've had a part...
It'd be really hard to test.
Why? Like,
Well, in part because everyone's been infected with the virus. Most people are actually been vaccinated. There might be some residual RNA. The PCR test to amplify the DNA I mean, you can amplify this RNA, convert it to DNA, and then you amplify it in sewage water. So, it's very, very hard to tell. Plus, at the end of the day, you have to have funding to do this. And the federal government is not interested in funding this kind of research in Canada or United States.
But is the blood of someone who's vaccinated is different than the blood of someone who's unvaccinated, right?
Well, not that much. No, that's my point, is that even with a blood transfusion, because soon after you're vaccinated, your body is naturally detoxifying itself. You have to be getting it a certain window, and it has to be a super sensitive test, and you don't even know what you're supposed to be looking for. Is it the RNA, or is it the spike protein? Because it could be exosomes, it could be lipid nanoparticles. It's really hard.
Nobody's mentioned graphene oxide.
No, and we're seeing it. Like, we're seeing it with the magnets, and we're seeing it in the sand on the beach. And
that's an interesting point. I mean, there's been, early on, there were reports that it seemed to be magnetic. That's not been seen in the more recent batches. So I think it's a such situation of purity. When you're purifying some of the components, you use what's called magneto beads. And you may have fragments of these. It could be like the stainless steel that we were talking about earlier. And these may have been early batches that aren't that pure. And so that phenomenon may have been an actual phenomenon. But we're not seeing it now. And the graphene oxide story, I'm sorry, I've tried to look at that literature, and really the only evidence is crystals under a microscope. And there's so many ways to get these kind of crystals that you can't tell from that it's graphene oxide. But some of the claims has been that 99.9% of it's graphene oxide. It's not possible. I mean, the lipid nanoparticles, they were developed by Peter Collis's groups at the University of BC. And I've been involved in that area too, not developing lipid nanoparticles, but lipid biochemistry, and his lab was right next door to the lab that I got my PhD, and I know many of the people that became the presidents of the spin-out companies. And so I know that to create these lipid nanoparticles, how much lipid you actually need, and graphene oxide, there's just no way you can make a lipid nanoparticle with even a 4 or 5% graphene oxide. Graphene oxide is commonly used, but it's not one of the listed ingredients in any of the vaccines. There's no compelling reason to believe that it should be there unless you're thinking that you're trying to put something toxic into people to kill them. Frankly, there's much, people in North America and Europe, our populations are already declining if it wasn't for immigration. Places like Africa and South America, this is where your birth rate is very high. You're not going to have much impact on the world population by reducing, even in a concerted fashion, our population in a very slow way with these vaccines. I just don't buy that theory.
So then is there also a correlation from lots of things I've been reading between 5G and the COVID shots, like that they work together hand in hand and the 5G makes it like 10 times worse?
Yeah, I can't comment on 5G in terms of the radiation. There's certainly a lot of it going through. We don't really know what the effects are on the body. We assume there isn't, but like, for example, like, your cell phone. We don't, for example, see a difference in the amount of brain cancer on the right-handed people that are going to be holding their cell phone to this side of your head as compared to left-handed on the other side of the head. So there's certain things that we'd be looking for, and we don't see those correlations. So, but I can't discount that there isn't harmful effects of 5G, and there is some evidence to support that, but it's so up in the air. We need more research.
Owen on Facebook.
Man.
Knows all those companies. He's really good.
Yeah, Owen is actually an agent for actors.
Yeah, Yes.
So he's not really in a position to really judge that kind of material.
He actually is.
Yeah.
Ask him.
Yeah.
Yeah, ask him. I just spoke with him this week. It's the first time I met him. And we talked for like an hour, and that's his
Oh, yeah, I know
job
he's very
before.
talkative. I talked to him.
He goes,
at-
wait, I got to talk to my actor. You're right.
Last Sunday, yeah, we were at actors presentation, and he was one of the people that were there, and we
He's really
chatted
smart.
for a bit.
He's very smart.
Yeah, he's a
And
very bright guy, don't get me
And
wrong.
Dr. Ryan Cole actually said last week, too, there's no graphene in the shots. You know Dr. Ryan Cole.
Yeah, exactly. Ryan
yeah,
Cole
yeah.
says exactly that.
And then
There's no
they went
graphene
berserk at the
oxide.
roundtable because it was the Critical COVID Care Alliance in the States, right? He was doing it there. And all the other doctors, it was like a free-for-all. They were angry. There was a disagreement.
Well, this is our problem, is we handicap the efforts of other organizations that are, we're just looking for the truth. We want to be evidence-based, balanced. And if we get some of these radical ideas that really have very little grounding, mixed in with what the message that we're trying to put across, we all get tarred with the same brush.
They're not affiliated. The COVID and the 5G is not affiliated, but 5G
No.
is a problem.
Oh, yeah, and that's something that I don't have expertise in, that I just can't comment, from an informed position.
Next question.
Thank you so much. Hello. First of all, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you so much for your integrity and your courage and just for what you stand for. I'm sure a lot of
Thank
people
you.
thank you, but thank you again from the bottom
Well,
of my
there's a
heart.
lot of people that are doing this, and a lot of my
Yes.
colleagues at the Canadian COVID Care Alliance and many other organizations, and Dr. Boucher and others, they've taken a lot of flack.
Yes.
But we know this is the right thing to do.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So my question to you is, in your personal opinion, what do you think about BC hiring Alberta's toxic waste in the name of Dina Hinshaw?
Well, I've already got my colleagues in Alberta.
Are you concerned?
saying that they're happy to get her out of the province. I think, in fairness to our public health officials, I think they're not trying to kill us. I don't think so. I think they are trying to do what they think is the right thing. I just wish that they would be more open-minded to look at the data, and then if they've made mistakes, to admit to them so we can move on. I think Diane Henshaw, she's going to have her qualifications, but the problem is that many of the people that are making the decision in these industry, in the ministries and that, they're more epidemiologists. So they don't have the advantage of understanding the molecular mechanisms of how these novel vaccines work, what the potential dangers can be. And they're looking at a situation where, as epidemiologists, there's almost no data. Until time goes on, they can accumulate it. And now, if they look back, I'm not so sure they would necessarily make the same decisions again. But this is what they got, and they want to be seen as competent, and they want to have the confidence of the public that they're making the right decisions, and it's really hard to backtrack from that. They're just too invested at this point. Yeah.
So,
So
chances are that they just won't do a 360 and turn around in any kind of way.
Danielle Smith, when Premier of Alberta, she's done a lot of amazing things in a really short order. The first thing she did was to fire, basically. Yeah, the Minister of Health and Henshaw. And she's looking to make a lot of change, but she has to maneuver very carefully because there's an election coming up. And she has to, as a politician often has to, she's got to try to consolidate the support. But I can tell you that there are groups of people that are working with her behind the scenes to help her. And if we can make a breakthrough in Alberta, it'll just
basically the rest will go down like dominoes.
Yeah. You know, she might lose, right?
She lose?
The unvaccinated lady who did the transplant?
Oh, yes, I know, and that's a difficult, but actually, we're testing her. Yeah, and I'm sure she'll have antibodies, and hopefully she can go back and show that data, that why do I need to get vaccinated if I've already got antibodies? So the tests that we've done for people have been very helpful in such scenarios.
Isn't that part of our Canada transplant program?
Yes.
South Carolina is.
Yeah, let's talk with the microphone. Who's the next question, please?
Sorry.
Hi. I just want to say thank you so much for this presentation, and also too for your courage and bravery and your standing up, your speaking, your willingness to speak, and also talking to you, Dr. Boucher, and all of the doctors and scientists. So I just want to appreciate all that you're doing.
Thank you. Kind words.
It really it seems really important, I think, for all of us, as we support you, to also stay very grounded. And I appreciate you just really bringing back, back to evidence-based, and that your commitment in the CCCA is to be very strongly sound and scientifically based.
Right.
I'm thinking that looking at the molecular, mechanisms, right, as to what's happening with these excess deaths is so important. And, is there even some simple steps that we can take to get ahead in the research, in understanding those deaths? Crowdfunding, can we get some momentum to have ways to do this research?
Right, because in Alberta, the major cause of death is adult sudden death syndrome of unknown cause. So what I think is happening is, I'm sure it's linked in part to the vaccine injury, but we've had a very stressed population for 3 years, and that stress reduces your immunity. And so it's going to make you more prone to having cancer and other diseases as well. Plus, the doctor-patient relationship, a fifth of the people in British Columbia don't have a family doctor. And so we're in a situation where these people, even if they have a family doctor, are not seeing them. They're not going to see them on a screen, but there is not that in the office, physical exam where you can look at body language and have more time that individual is going to tell them what's wrong, and then the doctor, with the diagnostic abilities they have, sometimes, it's one thing doing tests, but sometimes just listening to your patient can tell you an awful lot. I mean, you know that better than I. So I think what's happening is people aren't getting proper medical care on top of being highly stressed, on top of these vaccine injuries, and there may be other factors at play as well. But I think all of that creates a perfect storm, and that's what we're seeing.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a gentleman.
Something about stillbirths.
Why don't you take the microphone to him? Go ahead and make your comment, and then we'll go to his question back there. Go ahead, doctor.
You were going to say stillbirths?
Stillbirths. I will not sleep tonight if I don't beat the drum on stillbirths. So you probably don't remember, but over a year ago, I spoke out in front of the RCMP, 100 yards from the Lionsgate Emerge, about the plight of three doulas that came to my home for beer and pizza because we were ticked off. We had a lousy rally. This was just when I first started talking down at the Lonsdale Quay. And these women came up to me while we were commiserating and figuring out how we could have a better rally, and said, initially they gave me the wrong information, but they said that there had been 9 stillbirths in 2 nursing shifts at Women's Center, and they gave me the wrong dates. And I said, if we are both going to put our necks on the line, you you better get the facts right. So they obviously talked to the whistleblower who was not there and came back and said, September 18 and 19 of 21, 13 stillbirths happened in Women's Center in 2 nursing shifts. That blew me away. Daniel was there. They told him the same story. And when I thought of that for a minute, I got nauseated. How could they possibly cover this up? I mean, this is in the main referral hospital of the province, so we don't know how many of those women are vaccinated. I won't go on about it, but the complicity and the cover-up that has to occur for that to happen. I mean, what did these women say? What did the husband say when they came home and little Johnny said, "Where is my little sister? You promised me." How could they explain that? How could this happen? I mean, they're listening, they're closely monitoring these infants that have not yet been born. They know when the heart stops. How can you do ultrasounds? How can you do monitoring and say, oh yes, we hear the heartbeat, and then suddenly the baby is dead? That baby has been dead for weeks or months. It's incredible. So I spoke out about that, and because I was gesturing towards Lionsgate where I first started practicing, Bonnie and Coastal were able to say the whole thing was a hoax. That really sticks in my craw, and they're all going to pay one way or the other. That gets me to the golden standard in Waterloo, Ontario. I don't know if you remember this, but she was legal aid, and I can still see her standing preaching to a fairly large crowd. It was a very polished delivery. She just stated the facts, and the facts were that in a smaller hospital than Lionsgate, it's not a referral center in Waterloo, there were an 800% increase in stillbirths from January to July in 21. Every one of those women had been vaccinated, which gets to your point that the incidence of damage from these shots, in particularly the earlier months, but right through the menstrual cycle. I mean, people are aborting, they're miscarrying, their cycles are destroyed, they're infertile after this shot, and indefinitely. So nothing was done about that. I mean, normally, after thalidomide, this stuff is really closely looked at. I mean, if there's an increase of 2 or 3 stillbirths in a year, that should be investigated. Here they are, 800%, and nothing was done about it. It just disappeared. How can they do that? There's only so many ways. They either bribe you or they threaten you. And that's what's happening in these hospitals. The next step that I got involved with was through a wonderful American OBGYN maternal care who approached a mama bear in Ontario by the name of Terry Harder and said, what about this Bruchet guy? I heard he knows something about stillbirths in Canada. I heard this secondhand from her, and I thought, my God, there is a God. And he was genuinely interested, and he was a humble guy. He was the head cheese in a very posh, large hospital in Pensacola, Florida. He's done studies on this, he's spoken out about it, and he is getting more militant. When I heard about him, it took me a couple days to get a hold of him because he's very busy. We talked briefly, it was surreal. I told him just what I told you, and he said, wow. And then when I told him about Waterloo, he said, wow, wow. And I told him about my contact with Judy Stinson in the East, who's also the face of the Sniper. And I said, what is the situation in Peterborough? Hillsborough and similar small towns in the area, she said it's very similar, 750, 800% increase. When I told him that, he said, my editor is very interested in this. So the guy writes books, he's including me in his studies, and so I am hooking up with the who's who. He talks regularly with Ryan Cole, with Pierre Corey, with the elite, and that we need to unify on this. And the other doc that I want to get a hold of is Byram Bridle in Guelph, Ontario. He was sort of a labby guy like this guy. He isn't anymore. He speaks out. His plan is to basically shut down the injection sites until they can be proven to be safe, which is never. So that's what we have to do. The other big ally that we got is this no-name by the name of Elon. Elon is coming out and picking them off one by one. Fauci, adrenochrome, he doesn't give a damn. He also recently said, if you didn't hear, I had 2 serious side effects with my shots. Now, once he comes out like that, they cannot shut him up. And I don't care if he's from Pluto or he's the son of Aga Khan. I don't care. It's the same as, Smith. I mean, she's speaking out. She's walking the walk. And like you said, Stephen, it's not easy, but he doesn't give a damn. So he's just going to pick off each and every one. It turns out that my truck driver buddy he's in contact with Elon himself. So I said, do you think that maybe you could drop the name Bonnie Henry and fill in a few blanks on this? Why not? I mean, if he's pointed in the right direction, he's like a flippin' Irish setter. He's going to point and he's going to shoot. And that's what we need. So it is not hopeless. When I look at what information has come out about stillbirths, remember that heroic judge who remains nameless because he'd probably be dead, said to Pfizer, you have to reveal all your data. You cannot hide it for 75 years. When they did, they never did the damn studies. They did 90 rats with this thing. Guess what? They all died. Did that stop them? Hell no. Let's build a better shot. Kill more people. It is now in the States because of Jim Thorpe, my hero in Pensacola. This stuff goes international. You have to realize the world is waiting to hear from Canada, particularly about the truckers. And the truckers are the main driving force. Unfortunately, they goofed up and couldn't plan the second one. I was on that first call. The atmosphere was electric. In 1 hour, they knew exactly when they were going to go, where they were going to go, and everything. I talked to Alex about it, and he invited me to the meeting. The atmosphere was electric. Guys were throwing out, women were throwing out comments. Yeah, we could do this there, and Kusapay, we'll do that, and we'll do this, because they'd all done it. The learning curve is so much shorter. 2 days later, the egos got in and it fell apart. It'll come back. The world is waiting to hear from Canada. Our population is insignificant compared to the clout we have. So that's what we got to go with. We've got to unite these powerful groups like CCCA, like Vaccine Choice, like
Action for Canada.
Yeah, they're the groups that are moving. Ted Kuntz, I mean, they're electric. The vibe is just huge. We are going to bring it down. The only time is when. The faster, the better. So that's what you people have to do. You have to be aware of these groups and get in there and do something. We can't all be standing up here waving a monk. We need the flies on the wall. We need the the introverts, the ones that, strong silent types. That gets me to pushing the indigenous. Nothing is going to happen in this country. And the corporate Department of Indian Affairs is rotten, rotten, rotten. Every chief and council gets paid to inject their people. The people of the salmon have got problems, but they are sovereign and they are natural. We have to straighten that group out and move forward, and they can't do it by themselves. So get involved. That gentleman there, yes, I had to do it because he was going to start crying if I didn't mention the Sikhs. In Surrey, as you know, if the Sikhs don't drive the truck, there's not a lot of stuff moving. So we have to get these groups united. They're diverse, they're waiting to be awoke, and they are not coming to the parade. They're hiding, they're afraid, and that's all got to change. So enough already. I can go on and on about the stillbirths. I'm not going to do it, but they are going to be the...
Okay, next question.
Questions.
Next question, this gentleman back here.
Yeah, I really do believe that most of the, if you will call them the working doctors, medical professionals, et cetera, are well-intentioned. But some would look at, for example, our dramatic assisted suicide numbers and the incline they've been on as an argument that perhaps at the higher level the government is trying to kill us. I just wondered if you had a comment on that.
Well, in that sense, yes, the government is trying to kill us. I mean, the MAID program, it's the major source of organs now in the world is from Canada. Over 10,000 assisted deaths. The government decided to suspend implementation of the third phase, which would have been the assisting people that are of mental illness to have assisted suicide. They put that off for a year. But that's a whole big can of worms. And I think, you know, the original idea for people in the first phase, I think it was 2016, in the first phase, if you were dying, then this was a means to have a more humane death. But then the second phase was different, that you weren't necessarily dying, but you were suffering, but from a medical ailment. I mean, mental illness is, in a sense, a medical ailment, but the problem is that people that are in depression, one of the symptoms of that is suicide. So you do not want to offer that kind of an exit for people from their suffering by that kind of route. So this is a very big area. There's a lot of people that are actually taking this up. But that, I would agree with you, that's one example. Yeah.
Do you have a follow-up comment or next? Where are we at? Where are we at? Okay. In the back, lady over there, thank you.
Just based on what he said, I happen to work with the Indigenous community, and one of, I'd say she's my friend, she has diverticulitis and doesn't want to have any more surgeries. She has 2 teenagers in their, upper teens. And she said she was horrified because her doctor said that she could have medically assisted suicide. And he said, if you do it, we'll give each of your children $25,000 each. And she's in her, in her early 50s, and she was just appalled. She doesn't want to kill herself.
Yeah, I'm surprised. That's just not right. You can't tell. One of the other reasons why I'm concerned about that is that, for example, like prisons. If you got someone who's got a life sentence and they're in prison, they're suffering. Give them an exit. Does the government see that, hey, this is a great way to reduce our costs? And that's, I'm sure, what happened there. They're looking at the long-term costs, and it's cheaper to bribe the family, or not to bribe the family, but to bribe the individual that their family will be taken care of if they do this. This coercion is completely unacceptable.
Yeah. Okay, who's next? Microphone. Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Pelech and Mel Boucher, to enlighten us. So my question is, with your experience, do you think enough evidence exists between the communication between doctors, public health, hospital officials, media, which can incriminate them for criminality, knowing fully the side effects and everything and still pushing it and forcing it? Because not this government, but a new government can come up in BC, and can they go back?
Yes, they can go back. And, the excuse is going to be given, well, I was just following orders. I was just going with the information that was available. And that's why it's so important to get this information out and to doctors. And that's what we've been working on. And at some point, there will be some kind of accountability. I think it's two victims here. One is the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. The unvaccinated, our civil rights were taken away from us, even jobs. But the vaccinated, they may in fact be suffering from long-term illness. And they're not going to be happy about this, and even deaths in families. So there is going to be a reckoning, I'm sure of that.
Just to follow up, in the Nuremberg Code, also they said I was following orders, but if you keep going up the chain, you will find someone. And for your information...
Yeah, Justin Trudeau, I believe.
And a new BC political party has been formed. Its name is Freedom Party of British Columbia, as of January 9, 2023. And you're looking at their founders.
Oh, wow.
And you will know about a lot more about us coming days, and that's one of the main purposes to find it. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Okay, who's next? We have two here.
So, we've touched on everything except opioids.
Yeah, which are now
the legalized
drugs up to what, 2.5 milligrams of things like fentanyl? It's just crazy.
So it pops out.
Just
you think you're going to get 10 of them and go,
well, and what about the number of deaths that are going to come from that as well? And I don't know if you've seen Aaron Gunn's Vancouver is Dying. He's got a very, very...
Yes, I have. It's an excellent video. He makes six points.
Yeah.
And I think they're all valid points. And I think we all probably know people who have suffered from drug addiction, and the way you solve the problem isn't to make the drug supply more accessible. And the thing is that I think the people that are really pushing this, they're just trying to make it so that now the drugs are potentially safer, but let's let the taxpayer pay for it.
But the system failed, don't you think?
The system has failed, in my opinion, but, people say they want to reduce, harm reduction. I would like to actually see that data in more detail, whether that really works. We've seen what happens in some communities where these people need to often get money for their drugs, so there's increased petty crime. In Seattle, for example, they made it so that it's not a crime if you've mugged somebody for a certain amount of money.
Right.
And so it actually destroyed the downtown tourist area of Seattle. And they want to do the same thing here.
And didn't Oregon do this same trial, legalizing, and it didn't work?
That's right.
Yeah. So. Welcome to BC.
Okay, this gentleman here, please.
I just wanted to speak quickly about the mandates. It seems to me that the opposite of regulating safety and having a respect for human rights and for informed consent is mandating an experimental, never-before-used technology. It's like saying, we've got a Mach 1 aircraft, we've never tested it, we've never tried it, in fact, we've never built a plane, but everyone must ride on this plane. So there is a safety regulator who will remain unnamed, who has mandated for their staff this, which has caused innumerable injuries and incredible red flags. And they have suspended the mandate, but they have chosen to leave it open for further mandates. I don't understand how on earth, on God's green earth, we can have something that is so incredibly worse than thalidomide, so much worse than Vioxx, so much worse than the tainted blood scandal, and it's not just stopped, but we can't even stop the mandate. How on earth is this Canada? Like, honestly, I feel like I'm living in North Korea. It doesn't make any sense. Can somebody help me with this reality? I don't understand.
Yeah, well, I think your feelings and observations are being shared by more and more people. And when enough people see this, then we will see more action. Yeah.
Okay, right over here, please. Lady.
I just wanted to agree with what he says, because I feel like I'm living in a dream. I go to the doctor's office and you have to put the mask on, and I feel like I'm just a housewife, and I understand that the masks don't work. So how come my doctor's telling me to put the mask? It's very difficult psychologically to conciliate the two thoughts. It doesn't work, but you have to wear it.
One of the problems with the mask is it dehumanizes people. It puts them into a situation where they think, okay, I think, maybe some people wear it as virtue signaling, but I think there's a genuine concern on some people. They're just so I want to say paranoid, but they've been so brainwashed, but they're traumatized. They think they'll clutch onto anything, even if it doesn't work. Maybe it works, and so this is what happens. But when you have face masks like that all day long, it has health issues. You're rebreathing, you have 21% oxygen in the air. You inhale it, and it feeds your lungs to then send the oxygen to the rest of your bloodstream. And then the carbon dioxide products produced from your cells are then exchanged. And when you exhale, it's 14 to 16% oxygen and a higher concentration of carbon dioxide. I think it's 5% in the atmosphere of carbon dioxide normally. So what happens is, yes, the mask pore size allows atoms like carbon dioxide and oxygen to go through, but you have airflow. So when you have an obstruction like that, you actually rebreathe your lower concentration of oxygen. And your carbon dioxide levels go up in your blood, your oxygen levels go down, your brain gets less oxygen, you get brain fog, your learning for these kids in school is reduced, and you can have skin issues. You're accumulating the other bacteria and all that can eventually get through those masks, viruses. So it's actually extremely unhealthy, physically, psychologically, and there is still talk about bringing masking back into the schools. And you have these young kids, babies, that never see a smile. And when you have you meet your friends, I can look at you all and I can smile, and there's a sense that comes from that. But if I had a mask on, I was talking to you the whole time in a mask, it's a different experience. So this is the thing.
You need to know that Bonnie Henry 6 times in the month of June 21 said masks don't work.
Yeah.
What changed her mind? She had to.
Okay, last comment here, please. Right here, this lady. Thank you.
It's a Bill 36 question on the back of what she said. So if a person goes to a doctor and doesn't want to wear the mask, the doctor could basically just say, I don't want to see you, but
doctors can do that. Doctors can divorce their patients, and they often do.
So if that goes on to your record, that's a public thing now, that they can pass on to anybody. They can now deem you crazy and have to medicate you, like legally. They could do that, like completely say
I suppose. There's also Rate Your Doctor, where you can go back the other way.
What do you mean?
Rate your doctor.
Oh, yes, okay.
You don't say.
Because that's the
Kind
feeling.
of like Google reviews.
Okay, because they could do that now, right? They can just say you're nuts and you have to be medicated and bang, the little men in white come.
Okay, we're going to wrap this up now. Now, we have a check in here that we made out for the same amount as October 1 that he did not cash last time.
And I won't cash it this time.
Okay, we are going to give it, so everybody, we want you.
Absolutely.
We want you and your wife to take Dr. Mel out for dinner. Okay?
You got a deal.
See? Okay. Now we might actually get the check cash this time.
Well, we don't need to do that with that. I'll take him out for dinner anyways.
So, Dr. Mel, could you give it to him so that when he
Ain't gonna
arrives at the
happen.
restaurant, that he'll say, well, I'll just pay for it, you know?
Staple it.
Dr. Pelech.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mel, thank you very much. Thank you.
Sideshow.
Thank you very, very much.
And thank
Wonderful.
you all for staying so late and coming.
Thank you. Thank you all, everyone. Have a good night. Take your potatoes, sign the petition. 4th and Vine tomorrow if you want to help canvassing or anytime. Thank you. Have a good evening. All the best.